Hello and welcome to Whisper Garden, a quiet corner of YouTube where gentle stories help you slow down, unwind, and drift off to sleep. Every Tuesday and Thursday you'll find a new sleepy time tale, told in soft, soothing tones designed to calm your mind and ease you into restful slumber. If my stories bring you peace or help you rest, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more dreamers like you find their way here. Sweet dreams. Tonight's tale is The Lanterns of Windmere, a gentle story of wishes, healing, and quiet magic drifting through sea mist and lantern light. Chapter 1. Twilight Above the Tide. Callum Gray stood on his weathered porch as evening settled over Windmere. The small coastal town perched on the cliff's edge was already surrendering to twilight, its cobblestone streets gleaming damp from the day's light rain. Salt-laden air filled his lungs as he leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon where sea met sky in a blur of darkening blue. This was the hour when Windmere transformed. One by one, warm lights appeared along the shoreline and town square, not street lamps but lanterns, paper and bamboo craft, some traditional, others fanciful, all containing a small, steady flame that seemed to burn brighter than natural fire should. The townspeople emerged from their homes in ones and twos, each carrying their own lantern down to the water's edge or up to the cliffs. Callum had watched this ritual for years now, always from a distance, always from his porch. His telescope sat beside him on a small wooden table, though he rarely used it anymore. There wasn't much need to see the details. He knew what the lanterns contained: wishes, hopes, unspoken words, each carefully written on a slip of paper and tucked inside the glowing vessel before being released to the wind or water. His wife Elaine had loved the lantern ceremony. For 36 years she had written their wishes, her handwriting neat and precise, her words always better than anything he could muster. Sailors weren't poets, she used to tease him. But she had been gone for 5 years now, and he hadn't sent a lantern since. The fog was rolling in earlier than usual tonight, a soft grey blanket that muffled sounds and diffused the lantern light into hazy orbs. From his vantage point on the eastern cliffs, Callum could see the whole village below, the harbour to the west, and the old lighthouse whose beams swept rhythmically through the gathering mist. He reached for his mug of tea, long since gone cold, and was about to retreat inside when he heard the crunch of gravel on the narrow path leading to his door. Visitors were rare enough that he felt a twinge of concern. Around the bend came a small figure, hesitant but determined. Young Elsie Harmon, no more than 8 years old, her dark braids bouncing with each careful step. She clutched something to her chest, a paper lantern still unlit. "Mr. Gray?" Her voice was thin against the wind. "My mum said I shouldn't bother you, but—" She stopped at the foot of his steps, looking up with solemn eyes. "I need help." Callum set down his mug. "What kind of help, child?" She held up the lantern, simply made, but lovely. "I can't write my wish. I mean, I can write, but Dad says I need to find the right words, and I don't know what they are." "Your father can't help you?"
Elsie shook her head. "He doesn't write wishes anymore, not since Mom went away." She looked down at her shoes, rubber boots, practical for Windmere's perpetual dampness. "I want to wish for him to smile again, like he used to."
Something tightened in Callum's chest. He recognized the look in the child's eyes, that tentative hope tempered by a grief too heavy for small shoulders. Martin Harmon had lost his wife, Sarah, to the same illness that had taken Elaine, though more recently, just over a year ago, if he recalled correctly. "Come up then," he said, surprising himself. "But mind the third step. It creaks." Elsie hopped carefully over the offending step and followed him inside. His cottage was sparse but tidy. A sailor's discipline never quite leaves the bones. A writing desk sat beneath the window that faced the sea, piled with nautical charts and a half-finished letter to his sister on the mainland. A jar of sea glass caught the last of the daylight, sending small prisms across the wooden floor. "Sit there," he said, gesturing to his armchair. He pulled the chair from his desk and sat opposite her. "Now what exactly do you want to say?" Elsie placed the lantern carefully on the small table between them. "I want Dad to be happy again. He tries to pretend for me, but his eyes are always sad. He doesn't sing anymore or tell jokes." She twisted a braid around her finger. "I thought if I found the perfect wish, maybe the lanterns would help." Callum nodded slowly. Some in town believed the lanterns held actual magic, that properly worded wishes found their way to whatever power governed such things. He had never been certain of that, but he'd seen enough in his 68 years not to dismiss it outright. Windmere had always been a place where the veil between the ordinary and the mysterious felt unusually thin. "Do you have paper for the wish?" he asked. She produced a small square from her pocket, neatly folded. "Mom always used the nice paper with flowers on it, but I couldn't find any. This will do fine." He took a pen from his desk and thought for a moment, studying the child's hopeful face. "The trick to wishes," he said carefully, "isn't asking for exactly what you want. It's asking for the path toward it." Elsie frowned slightly. "I don't understand."
"Well," Callum said, rolling the pen between his fingers, "if you wish for your father to smile, that might just make him pretend harder, see? But if you wish for something that leads to real smiles..." He paused, then began to write in his steady, unpracticed hand. "Let the morning light find its way back into our kitchen. Let laughter remember where it used to live." He showed it to Elsie, who read it slowly, mouthing the words. "Is that right?" she asked. "I think it might be. Sometimes the lanterns understand what we mean better than what we say." She nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who hasn't yet learned to doubt such statements. "Will you help me light it? Dad's waiting down by the shore, but he said he didn't want to climb all the way up here." Callum found a matchbox and carefully lit the small candle within the lantern. Its glow immediately warmed the darkening room, casting long shadows against the walls. "There," he said. "Best hurry now before the wind picks up." Elsie took the lantern carefully, holding it away from her body as she'd clearly been taught. At the door, she turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Gray. Will you watch for my lantern? It has a blue ribbon on the bottom." "I'll keep an eye out," he promised. After she'd gone, Callum returned to his porch. The fog had thickened, but he could still make out the gathering of people at the water's edge, their lanterns creating a constellation of earthbound stars. He found his telescope after all and trained it on the shore. There was Martin Harmon, tall and too thin, his face partially hidden by the beard he'd grown since Sarah's passing, and beside him, Elsie, carefully handing him the lantern. Callum couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Martin kneel down beside his daughter, saw his hand brush her cheek, before they both released the lantern together. It rose slowly at first, caught in competing air currents, then found its path upward, the blue ribbon fluttering below like a tiny comet's tail. Callum followed its ascent until it disappeared into the mist, one more light among the dozens now floating above Windmere. He stayed outside long after the ceremony ended, long after the townspeople had returned to their homes. The lanterns continued their journey, some rising until they vanished into the night sky, others drifting out to sea, where they would eventually sink beneath the waves. A few always seemed to hover, neither rising nor falling, as if waiting for something. That night, Callum dreamed of Elaine. Not the frail figure from her final days, but the woman who had laughed into the wind as they sailed their small boat around the harbour, her hair a banner of copper in the sunlight. In the dream,
She was writing on slips of paper, folding them into tiny boats that she set adrift in a pool of light. "What are you wishing for?" he asked her. She looked up, her smile familiar and painful in its clarity. "I'm not wishing. I'm remembering." The next morning, Callum walked into town for supplies, a weekly ritual he usually completed as efficiently as possible. As he passed the small schoolhouse, he paused. Martin Harmon stood at the gate, saying goodbye to Elsie. The man's coat was unbuttoned despite the morning chill, and though his face was still lean with grief, there was something different about him. He tousled Elsie's hair and said something that made her laugh before she ran inside. As Martin turned to leave, he caught sight of Callum and raised a hand in greeting. "Morning," he called. "Morning," Callum replied, noting the slight but unmistakable lift at the corners of Martin's mouth. Not quite a smile, perhaps, but the memory of one. Martin hesitated, then crossed the street toward him. "Elsie said you helped her with her lantern last night." He shifted awkwardly. "She's got it in her head that they're magic, the lanterns. Her mother always encouraged that sort of thinking." "No harm in it?" Callum said. "No, I suppose not." Martin looked toward the schoolhouse. She was different this morning, singing to herself while she got ready. He cleared his throat. "Anyway, thank you for humoring her." Callum nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "She's a good child." "She is." Martin seemed about to say more, then changed his mind. "Well, I should get to the boatyard. Good day to you." Callum watched him go, noting the straightness of his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Coincidence? Most likely. A good night's sleep, perhaps, or simply the natural healing that time brings. But as he continued his walk to the market, Callum found himself glancing up at the foggy sky, wondering which direction Elsie's lantern had finally travelled. Chapter 2. The Lantern Box. 3 days later, Callum found a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a small stone on his porch steps. Written in careful block letters was a simple request. "Mr. Gray, could you please write a wish for me? I'll come for it tomorrow. Mrs. Thorne." He recognized the name, Beatrice Thorne, the baker's wife, a quiet woman who ran the small library 2 afternoons a week. What she could want with his words, he couldn't fathom. Nevertheless, that evening he found himself at his desk, a blank slip of paper before him. He had no idea what Mrs. Thorne might wish for. Health? Her husband prospered well enough. They had grown children who visited regularly from the mainland. After an hour of consideration, he wrote, "May the forgotten stories find their voices again. May what was lost in time be rediscovered in quiet moments." He wasn't sure if it would mean anything to her, but it felt right somehow. He folded the paper and left it in the same spot where he'd found her note. It was gone by morning. 2 days after that, another note appeared. "Dear Mr. Gray, the perfect words for my grandson's coming-of-age lantern, if you please. He leaves for university in the autumn. Edmund Weller." Callum knew the boy slightly. Bright, eager with his grandfather's talent for woodworking, but dreams that stretched beyond Windmere's shores. This wish came more easily. Let curiosity be your compass, and courage your sail. The harbours yet undiscovered are already waiting for your arrival. The requests continued 1 or 2 each week. A note from Jane Fisher, asking for words for her sister's wedding lantern. One from the new school teacher, Mr. Bennett, seeking something for the children's end-of-term ceremony. Most didn't specify what the wish was for, simply asking for the right words and trusting him to provide them. By the 3rd week, Callum had taken to keeping a small wooden box on his porch with a slot in the top. Lantern wishes he'd burned into the lid with an old soldering iron. People would leave their notes and return the next day to find their wishes written in his steady hand. He never spoke of it when he encountered these same neighbours in town, and they seemed to respect the unspoken agreement. The wishes remained private, anonymous in their way, though everyone knew where they came from. The strangest part was how they affected him. Each night, after completing the day's wishes, Callum would sit on his porch and watch the lanterns rise. More often than not, he could identify which carried his words. They seemed to burn with a steadier flame, to rise more purposefully. Or perhaps that was his imagination, a sailor's tendency to find patterns in natural phenomena. Either way, he found himself looking forward to the task. It gave shape to his days, filled the empty hours that had stretched before him since retirement. He began keeping a journal of the wishes he wrote, though never with names attached. Sometimes he would reread them and wonder about their outcomes. Had Edmund Weller's grandson taken those words to heart as he packed for university? Had Jane Fisher's sister found happiness in her marriage? He had no way of knowing, and yet he felt connected to these moments in his neighbours' lives in a way he hadn't since Elaine's passing. One morning in early May, as Windmere shook off the last chill of spring, Callum found not a note, but a visitor waiting on his porch. Martin Harmon stood awkwardly beside the wish-box, his cap in his hands. "Morning," Callum said, hiding his surprise. "Can I help you?" Martin cleared his throat. "Elsie told me I should ask you to write a wish for me. Says yours work better than anyone else's." He attempted a smile. "Normally I'd chalk it up to a child's fancy, but—" "But?" Callum prompted when the man fell silent. "Things have been different since that night. Lighter, somehow. I've been remembering things I thought I'd forgotten. Good things about Sarah, not just the ending." He twisted his cap. "I've started singing again, while I work. Didn't even notice until Elsie pointed it out."
Callum nodded slowly. "I'm glad to hear it. So I thought perhaps—" Martin reached into his pocket and produced a folded slip of paper. "I wrote down what I think I want to wish for, but the words don't seem right. Would you—"
"Of course." Callum took the paper, but didn't open it. "I'll have it ready by evening." After Martin left, Callum sat at his desk and carefully unfolded the note. Inside, in a cramped, uncertain hand, was written, "I wish to move forward without leaving her behind." He understood immediately. It was the impossible challenge of grief. How to continue living without feeling like each step forward was a betrayal of what was lost. He had wrestled with it himself, still did on the darkest nights. After much consideration, he wrote, "Let memory be a sail that catches the wind, not an anchor that holds against it. Let love transform from absence into presence." That evening, Martin's lantern rose, straight and true from the western cliffs, its light unwavering even as it disappeared into the starry sky. Word continued to spread. People came from the far side of Windmere, some Callum barely knew by sight. A retired schoolteacher who lived alone near the old mill. A young couple expecting their first child. The lighthouse keeper's nephew visiting for the summer. Most simply left notes, but occasionally someone would linger, hoping to speak with him directly. These encounters were brief, halting. Few explained exactly what they were wishing for, and Callum never asked. Some things were better left unspoken, felt only in the spaces between words. The lantern ceremonies grew larger. Where once a dozen lights might rise above Windmere on an ordinary evening, now 30 or 40 glowed against the darkening sky. The town had always been subdued, shaped by the rhythms of sea and fog, but now there was a quiet vibrance to it, a collective breath held and released with each night's ritual. Callum watched it all from his porch, a spectator to something he had unwittingly helped create. It wasn't that the lanterns themselves were new, nor the tradition of wishes, but something had changed in the way people approached them. There was more intention now, more hope. On the first truly warm evening of summer, as he sat working through that day's wishes, a soft knock came at his door. He opened it to find Elsie Harmon, this time accompanied by her father. "Mr. Gray?" Martin said with a nod. Elsie has something she'd like to give you. The girl stepped forward, presenting a small cloth-wrapped bundle. I made it myself, she said proudly. Well, Dad helped with the hard parts. Callum unwrapped it carefully to reveal a lantern unlike any he'd seen before. Where most in Windmere were simple affairs of paper and bamboo, this was crafted of delicate wooden strips, carved with intricate patterns that would cast beautiful shadows when lit. The paper panels between the wooden framework were dyed a deep blue that reminded him of the twilight sea. It's for you, Elsie explained, for your wishes. Callum ran a weathered finger over the fine craftsmanship. I don't send wishes anymore. Maybe you should, Martin said quietly. Seems to work for the rest of us. Before Callum could respond, Elsie pointed to the base of the lantern, where a small drawer was built into the wooden frame. Look, it has a secret compartment for extra wishes. Dad says you never know when you might think of more than one. The thoughtfulness of the gift left Callum momentarily speechless. He cleared his throat. This is very fine work. Thank you. Will you use it? Elsie asked earnestly. He met her hopeful gaze, then looked up at Martin, who was watching him with quiet understanding. Perhaps someday, Callum said finally. For now, it deserves a place of honor. He set it carefully on the small table near his window, where the setting sun caught its blue panels and set them aglow. That night, after Martin and Elsie had gone, and the usual lanterns had risen above Windmere, Callum sat at his desk longer than usual. He opened his journal to a blank page and began to write. Not wishes this time, but memories. Elaine teaching him to dance in their small kitchen, both of them laughing as he stepped on her toes. The way she'd insist on swimming in the sea well into October, claiming it kept the blood strong. Her collection of oddly shaped stones that she'd arrange and rearrange on their windowsills. The words came more easily than he'd expected, filling page after page until his hand cramped and his vision blurred with fatigue. When he finally closed the journal, the moon was high and the town was dark, save for the distant lighthouse beam. He glanced at the blue lantern on his table, its delicate shadows painting the wall in the moonlight. Not tonight, he thought, but soon. Chapter 3. The Widow with No Voice. The fog arrived early the next morning, rolling in from the east rather than the sea, an unusual direction that the older fishermen claimed always preceded a change in weather. By noon, Windmere was wrapped in a cocoon of grey, the lighthouse horn sounding its mournful warning every 30 seconds. Callum had planned to work in his small garden, but the heavy dampness in the air aggravated his old shoulder injury. Instead, he spent the day indoors, organising the growing collection of wish notes and completing a letter to his sister that had been half finished for weeks. As evening approached, he checked the lantern box, expecting it to be empty given the weather. To his surprise, a single folded paper sat inside, dampened by fog but still legible. Unlike the usual notes, this one contained no written request, just a pressed flower, dried and delicate, that he recognized as sea lavender. There was no name, but he knew immediately who had left it. Ida Wells lived in the small cottage nearest the northern beach, a stone's throw from where the sea lavender grew in abundance during the late summer months. She had been married to a fisherman, Thomas, whose boat had been lost in a sudden squall 15 years earlier. They never found his body. Since that day, Ida had not spoken a single word, not in grief, not in anger, not even in practical necessity. She communicated through gestures, notes when required, but mostly she kept to herself, tending her garden and walking the shore at low tide. Callum studied the pressed flower, turning it carefully in his fingers. What wish could be contained in such a silent token? What words could possibly bridge 15 years of self-imposed silence? He set aside his other tasks and focused solely on this challenge. The usual approaches seemed insufficient. This wasn't about moving forward or finding new joy. Ida had crafted a life within her silence, functional if solitary. No, this was something deeper, something unresolved between her and the sea that had taken her husband. As twilight thickened into evening, Callum was still considering his response when a soft tap came at his door. He opened it to find Ida herself standing on his porch, her grey hair falling in a long braid over one shoulder, her weathered face composed and patient. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two people shaped by absence, recognizing the shared contours of loss. "Would you like to come in?" he asked finally. She nodded and followed him inside, her movements deliberate and quiet. She wore a faded blue dress and carried a small woven bag, from which she produced a lantern, simple but beautiful, clearly made by her own hands. The paper was embedded with dried flowers, visible only when light shone through them. Callum gestured to his armchair, and she sat, placing the lantern on the table between them. Neither spoke. The room filled with the sound of the foghorn, the distant crash of waves, the settling of the old cottage. After several minutes, Ida reached into her bag again and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. She offered it to Callum, who accepted it with questioning eyes. It was a journal, the pages yellowed with age and sea air. Inside, in a tight nautical hand, were daily entries spanning years, Thomas's shipboard log, maintained with a sailor's discipline, weather conditions, coordinates, cargo notes, occasional personal observations. The final entry, dated the day of his disappearance, read simply, "Squall building to the west, making for harbour, should arrive by nightfall." Callum looked up from the journal to find Ida watching him intently. Her eyes, grey as the sea itself, held a question he could almost hear, despite her silence. "You want me to write a wish?" he said, not quite a question. She nodded once, then made a gesture toward the journal, then toward the window that faced the ocean. "Something for Thomas?" he guessed. "Or about Thomas?" She shook her head slightly, then placed her hand flat against her own chest. "For me," the gesture said clearly. "A wish for me." Callum nodded slowly. "I understand. Will you wait while I write it?"
Another nod.
He moved to his desk and took out a fresh slip of paper, the finest he had, cream-coloured with a subtle pattern that resembled waves when held to the light. As he picked up his pen, he was acutely aware of Ida's presence behind him, the weight of 15 years of silence waiting to be translated into words. What eventually flowed from his pen surprised him. "I wish for the sea to know I forgive it. And in forgiving it, to find my voice has been there all along, waiting beneath the waves." He read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and turned back to Ida. She had risen and stood by the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded ocean. When she sensed him watching, she turned. Callum held out the folded wish. "Is this what you came for?" She crossed the room and took it from him, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she placed it against her heart and closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she gave him a smile so fleeting he might have imagined it. Then she tucked the wish inside her lantern, removed a small tinderbox from her bag, and lit the candle within. The flame caught quickly, illuminating the pressed flowers in the paper. They seemed to float, suspended in light. Without a word, of course, she nodded her thanks and left, carrying the glowing lantern carefully down the path that led to the northern beach. Callum followed at a distance, unwilling to intrude on her private ritual, but drawn to see its completion. The fog had thinned slightly, allowing glimpses of the crescent moon between drifting clouds. The tide was coming in, each wave reaching a little further up the sand. Ida walked to the water's edge and stood with the lantern held before her. She was a slim figure against the vastness of the sea, solitary but somehow not diminished by the comparison. For long minutes she remained motionless, as if in silent conversation with the waves. Then, with a gesture both gentle and definitive, she released the lantern. It bobbed on the incoming tide, moving not outward as most sea-launched lanterns did, but parallel to the shore, following the current that curled around the northern headland. As the lantern drifted away, Ida began to sing.
The sound was so unexpected, so otherworldly in the fog-muffled night, that Callum felt the hairs rise on his arms. Her voice was rough from disuse, but hauntingly clear, carrying over the rhythm of the waves. The melody was one he recognized, an old sea chanty that the fishermen used to sing when bringing their boats to harbour.
Bring me home, through the wind and foam, light the way through darkness deep,
guide me home across the deep.
Her song followed the lantern until it disappeared around the headland, swallowed by distance and fog. Only then did she fall silent again, though this silence felt different, chosen rather than imposed. As she turned to leave the beach, she caught sight of Callum standing at the edge of the dunes. She showed no surprise at his presence, only acknowledgement. And then, in a voice hoarse but steady, she spoke her first words in 15 years. "Thank you for finding what I couldn't say." She didn't wait for his response, but walked past him toward the path that led to her cottage, her braids swinging gently with each step. Callum remained on the beach long after she'd gone, listening to the waves and thinking of all the words that remained unspoken in the world, all the silences waiting to be broken by the right wish at the right moment. The next morning, as he walked into town, he passed Ida's cottage and heard something that stopped him in his tracks, singing. Her voice, stronger now, lifted in a folk song his mother used to hum while hanging laundry. He continued on his way without lingering, a strange lightness in his chest, despite the fog that still clung to Windmere's edges. In town, he noticed people glancing toward the northern beach, clearly having heard the same thing. No one mentioned it directly, but there was a collective awareness, a quiet joy at something long lost and suddenly returned. By midday, 3 new notes had appeared in the lantern box. Chapter 4. Fog that listens. The unusual fog persisted for days, then weeks, defying the usual patterns of Windmere's weather. It wasn't the heavy, blinding mist that sometimes blew in from the sea, but something gentler, more diffuse. Its softened edges, muted sounds, created pools of stillness throughout the town. Most strangely, it seemed to respond to the lanterns. Each evening, as the glowing vessels rose from cliff and shore, the fog parted slightly to allow their passage, then closed again like a curtain drawn across the sky. Those that drifted out to sea left tunnels of clear air in their wake before the mist flowed back to fill the vacancy. Callum observed this phenomenon with increasing fascination. In his years at sea, he had witnessed countless natural wonders. St. Elmo's fire dancing along the rigging, the green flash at sunset, bioluminescent waters that turned the ocean to liquid stars. But this deliberate interaction between fog and flame struck him as something beyond natural explanation. The lantern wishes continued to arrive daily, and he fulfilled each one with careful consideration. The task had become essential to his routine, something he looked forward to with quiet anticipation. Each blank slip of paper represented a chance to find the perfect words, to potentially change someone's path in some small but significant way. He began taking longer walks through town, observing his neighbours more closely. He noticed changes, subtle shifts in behaviour or circumstance that might be attributed to the wishes he'd written. The fishmonger's wife, who had asked for words about her son's nightmares, now hummed as she worked. The shadows beneath her eyes faded. The old man who lived near the church and had left a note about regret now sat in the town square playing chess with former friends he'd avoided for years. Coincidences, perhaps, the natural ebb and flow of fortune and mood, but Callum found himself believing otherwise. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the lanterns rise, he noticed something unusual in the fog, a flicker of movement that didn't match the wind's pattern. He squinted, thinking it might be a bird, or perhaps a trick of the fading light. It came again, closer this time, a ripple in the mist that seemed almost deliberate. As he watched, the fog thickened, then shaped itself into what appeared to be a human figure. It was indistinct, more suggestion than substance, but unmistakably a young boy running along an invisible path, arms outstretched as if flying. The apparition lasted only seconds before dissolving back into formless mist. Callum blinked, wondering if his eyes were playing tricks in the half-light. But even as the thought formed, another shape emerged, a couple dancing slowly, their movements graceful despite their nebulous form. Over the next hour, as darkness settled completely over Windmere, Callum witnessed a dozen such manifestations. A woman hanging laundry, an old man with a fishing pole, 2 children playing catch with a ball that left trails in the fog. None lasted more than a few moments, and none seemed aware of his presence or each other. When he finally went inside, chilled more by wonder than the night air, Callum found himself reaching for his journal. He recorded what he'd seen in careful detail, including the time and direction of each apparition. The visions continued over the following nights, always at twilight, always brief, always mundane in their activities, yet somehow profound in their very ordinariness. Callum wasn't the only one to notice. He overheard conversations in town, fragmentary accounts of similar sightings. "Like memories given shape," Mrs. Thorne said to her husband outside the bakery. "Windmere showing us its ghosts," suggested the blacksmith with an uneasy laugh. "The lanterns bringing back what we've forgotten," whispered a child to her friend as Callum passed. Whatever they were, the fog figures seemed harmless, even comforting in their familiar routines. And they coincided with other, less supernatural changes in the town. People lingered outdoors after the lantern ceremonies, gathering in small groups to talk quietly as the lights ascended. Neighbours who had merely nodded in passing for years now stopped to converse. The pub stayed open later, filled with gentle laughter and the occasional song. Even the flowers seemed more vibrant, the gardens more lush, despite the limited sunlight. Windmere had always been a close community by necessity, isolated, weather-beaten, shaped by the rhythms of the sea. But now there was something more intentional in that closeness, as if the fog had not only surrounded them physically but somehow bound them more tightly to each other. Callum found evidence of this change on his own doorstep one morning, a small bunch of sea lavender tied with twine left beside the lantern box. There was no note, but he recognized it as Ida's gesture of thanks. The next day, a jar of honey appeared, almost certainly from the Thompsons' hives on the south slope. The day after, a carefully wrapped fish, fresh caught and gutted. He accepted these offerings with quiet gratitude, though the attention made him somewhat uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition for the lantern wishes, had never considered them anything but private exchanges between himself and those who asked. That the town now viewed him as some sort of central figure in their collective ritual was both touching and disconcerting. On a particularly still evening in late June, as Callum worked through that day's wishes at his desk, a knock came at his door. It was Martin Harmon, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, "but there's something I thought you should see." Curious, Callum followed him down the path toward town. The fog was especially thick tonight, swirling around their ankles and obscuring anything more than 20 paces ahead. As they neared the town square, Callum began to hear voices, many voices speaking in hushed tones. "What's happening?" he asked. Martin glanced back at him. Hard to explain, better shown. They emerged into the square to find nearly half the town gathered there, despite the hour and the weather. People stood in small clusters, some holding lanterns not yet released, others empty-handed. Children darted between the groups, playing some game that involved touching the fog and then running away before it could catch them. As Callum and Martin arrived, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, to Callum's astonishment, they began to applaud, not raucously, but with a gentle, sincere appreciation that made his face warm with embarrassment. "What is this?" he asked Martin in a low voice. Before Martin could answer, the mayor stepped forward. Eleanor Pierce was a practical woman in her 60s who ran the town with quiet efficiency and minimal ceremony. Tonight, however, she seemed almost ceremonial as she approached Callum. "We wanted to thank you," she said simply. "For the lanterns, for the wishes, for bringing something back to Windmere that we didn't know was missing." Callum shifted uncomfortably. "I've done very little." "You've done more than you know," Eleanor replied. She gestured around the square. "Look at us. When was the last time we gathered like this, not for a funeral or a storm warning?" It was true. The townspeople were animated in a way Callum hadn't seen in years. There was a collective energy, a sense of shared purpose that transcended the usual practicalities of coastal life. "The fog shows us things," a voice called from the crowd, the lighthouse keeper, Jeremiah White. "Things we've forgotten or never knew, ever since the wishes became stronger."
Murmurs of agreement rose from the gathering. Callum noticed that everyone was looking not just at him, but through him, as if seeing something in the fog behind him. He turned.
There, shimmering in the mist, was the clearest apparition yet, a woman walking slowly along an invisible shoreline, her hair lifting in a breeze no one could feel. Though her features were indistinct, composed of swirling tendrils of fog, there was something unmistakably familiar in her posture, in the way she paused to look out at an unseen horizon. Elaine. The vision lasted longer than any previous one, nearly a full minute, before dissolving back into formless grey. When Callum turned back to the crowd, he saw a mixture of awe and understanding on their faces. "They're not ghosts," Elsie Harmon said suddenly, her child's voice clear in the silence. "They're memories. Our memories, all mixed together." Out of the mouths of babes, Callum thought. The girl had articulated what he'd been sensing, but couldn't quite name. The fog figures weren't supernatural visitations, but externalized remembrances, the collective memory of Windmere made briefly visible. "The lanterns are changing things," Eleanor said. "Changing us. And we wanted you to know that we see it, and we're grateful." Callum didn't know how to respond. He had been a solitary man for so long, comfortable in his isolation, that this public acknowledgement felt almost invasive. And yet, beneath his discomfort, was a warming sense of connection he'd thought lost to him. "I only write down what people already know in their hearts," he said finally. "The words were always there. I just find them." "Nevertheless," Eleanor replied, "we wanted to mark the occasion." At her signal, several people stepped forward, each carrying a lantern. But unlike the individual wishes that normally rose above Windmere, these were all connected by thin strands of silk, a constellation of lights bound together. "A collective wish," Martin explained quietly. "For the town. For all of us." With careful coordination, the lantern bearers moved to form a circle. Eleanor produced a slip of paper, larger than usual, folded several times. "We each contributed a word or phrase," she said, offering it to Callum. "But it needs your hand to bind them together." He accepted the paper reluctantly and unfolded it to find dozens of fragments in different handwritings: memory, harbour, home, light, forgiveness, tomorrow, voice, connection. The crowd watched expectantly as he read. After a moment of hesitation, Callum borrowed a pen from someone nearby and added his own contributions, weaving the disparate elements into a cohesive whole. "Let Windmere be a harbour for memory, where each light guides another home. Let our voices, joined in both silence and song, create connections that neither fog nor time can diminish. Let tomorrow recognize yesterday without being bound by it." He refolded the paper and handed it back to Eleanor, who read it aloud to murmurs of approval. Then she divided it into several pieces, giving one to each lantern bearer to place within their light. As the lanterns were lit one by one, the fog around the square thinned, creating a dome of clear air above them. When all were glowing, the bearers stepped back, still holding the silken cords that bound the lights together. "All together," Eleanor instructed. In unison they released the lanterns, which rose as a single unit, a floating island of light that ascended slowly through the dome of clear air. Unlike normal lanterns, these didn't disperse, but maintained their formation, drifting toward the sea in perfect alignment. And as they watched, the fog around them filled with visions, dozens of them, overlapping, interweaving. Children playing on beaches long since eroded away, fishermen mending nets on docks that had been rebuilt 3 times in living memory, weddings, funerals, festivals, ordinary days, the visual history of Windmere suspended in mist. Some in the crowd gasped or pointed, recognizing loved ones or younger versions of themselves. Others stood silent, tears tracking down their faces. Callum found himself reaching out instinctively as a fog. Elaine passed nearby, her form already dissolving, but her presence unmistakable. The visions lasted until the connected lanterns disappeared from sight, carried out to sea by the evening breeze. As the final apparition faded, the square grew quiet again, but it was a rich silence, full of shared emotion and unspoken understanding. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said finally to the gathering, "for being part of this." As people began to disperse, many stopped to shake Callum's hand or touch his shoulder in passing. No lengthy expressions of gratitude, no dramatic declarations, just simple acknowledgements of connection. It was, he thought, very much in keeping with Windmere's character. Martin waited until the square had nearly emptied before speaking again. "Will you be all right walking back alone? The fog's getting thicker again." Callum nodded. "I know the way." As he made his solitary journey back to his cottage, Callum felt both drained and oddly invigorated. The public attention had been uncomfortable, yes, but there was something powerful in witnessing the effect of the lantern wishes on the wider community. What had begun as a simple act of kindness toward Elsie had grown into something that touched the entire town. And perhaps, he admitted to himself, it had touched him as well. The wishes he wrote for others had somehow begun to work their quiet magic on his own heart, opening doors he'd thought permanently closed. At his cottage, he found one more surprise waiting. A carved wooden sign mounted beside his door, the letters burned deep into the cedar. "The Lantern Writer." He ran his fingers over the inscription, feeling both the rough edges of the carving and the smooth finish of the wood. Someone had put great care into this gift. That night, as he prepared for bed, Callum glanced at the blue lantern Elsie and Martin had given him, still sitting unused on his table. Perhaps it was time, he thought. Perhaps he had wishes of his own worth sending into the fog. But not tonight. Tonight he was content to lie in the darkness and listen to the distant foghorn, to the waves breaking against the cliff below, to the occasional muffled voices of late-night lantern launchers on the shore. Sounds of Windmere, his home, now in more ways than it had been for years. Just before sleep claimed him, he could have sworn he heard Elaine's laugh, not from a dream or memory, but carried on the fog that pressed against his window, listening. Chapter 5. What I Never Wrote. The morning arrived with unexpected clarity. For the first time in weeks, the fog had retreated, revealing a sky so intensely blue it almost hurt to look at it. The town below Callum's cottage gleamed in the sunlight, rooftops and window panes flashing like signals. He took his morning tea on the porch, enjoying the warmth on his face and the unobstructed view of the harbour. Ships moved in and out with cheerful efficiency, making up for time lost during the foggy spell. Children ran along the shore, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. It was, by any measure, a perfect summer day in Windmere. And yet, Callum found himself oddly unsettled by the absence of the fog. He had grown accustomed to its softening presence, its way of creating intimate spaces within the larger landscape, Without it, everything seemed slightly too sharp, too exposed. After breakfast, he checked the lantern box and found it empty for the first time in weeks. Perhaps the sunshine had temporarily suspended the town's need for wishes. Or perhaps the collective ceremony in the square had satisfied some deeper hunger. With no wishes to write, Callum turned to practical matters, weeding his small garden, repairing a loose step on his porch, sorting through a box of old navigational instruments he'd been meaning to clean and oil. It was while searching for a specific tool in his sea chest that he found the journal, not his current one, but an older volume, its leather cover cracked and salt-stained. He recognized it immediately as the one he'd kept during Elaine's final illness, though he hadn't opened it since her passing. He set it aside, intending to return it to the chest, but something about the day's clarity seemed to demand equal honesty from him. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up again and carried it to his desk. The journal fell open naturally to the last entry, dated 5 years earlier, the day after Elaine's funeral. The page contained only a few lines in a handwriting less steady than his usual script. "She's gone. The house empty. Cannot think beyond this moment. Cannot imagine the next hour, much less tomorrow."
I should have told her. The sentence broke off there, the rest of the page blank. Callum stared at it, remembering how he'd sat at this same desk, pen poised, unable to complete the thought. Not because he didn't know what he should have told her, but because writing it would make his failure permanent, irrevocable.
He turned back through the pages, reading entries from the months of Elaine's decline. They were sparse, factual, medications administered, doctor's visits, changes in symptoms, very little of his own feelings recorded, as if documenting them would somehow make her illness more real. Tucked between the pages near the end, he found something unexpected, a folded piece of paper, the kind used for lantern wishes, though yellowed with age. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it, to find his own writing. "Let me find the courage to tell her how completely she changed me. How the man I became was only possible because she saw who I could be. Let her know, even in leaving, she is not diminishing but expanding. Ripples on water, light through fog." It was a wish he had written but never sent, never even shown to Elaine. He had composed it during her final days, intending to release it during the lantern ceremony. But when the moment came, he couldn't bring himself to join the others on the shore. Instead, he had stayed by her bedside, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The wish had remained unsent, unspoken, eventually forgotten within the pages of his journal, one final failure of courage when it mattered most. Callum sat for a long time with the paper in his hands, feeling the weight of words that had never found their recipient. All around him, the cottage was filled with morning sunlight, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Outside his window, Windmere continued its day, unaware of the small, private revelation taking place on the cliff. With sudden decision, Callum reached for his current journal and a fresh sheet of paper. On the new sheet, he carefully copied the old wish, his hand steadier now, despite the emotion behind the words. When he finished, he placed it on his desk and returned to the sea chest. From its depths, he retrieved a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl, a gift from Elaine on their 20th anniversary. Inside were mementos of their life together: the dried flower from her wedding bouquet, a smooth stone from the beach where they'd first met, the ribbon from her hair on the day he'd proposed. He added the original wish to these treasures and closed the box, returning it to the chest. Then he took the copy to the blue lantern that still waited on his table. The lantern was as beautiful as the day Elsie had given it to him, its wooden framework gleaming in the sunlight, its blue panels rich with colour. He carefully opened one side and placed the wish inside, then closed it again, running his fingers over the intricate carvings. Not yet, he thought. Not in this revealing sunlight. Some things belong to the twilight, to the space between day and night where transitions were possible. He spent the remainder of the day in a state of quiet anticipation, watching the sun's slow arc across the sky. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon, not threatening but substantial, promising a spectacular sunset. As the first golden light of evening slanted through his window, Callum lit a small candle and carried it and the blue lantern out to his porch. The town below was preparing for its nightly ritual, figures moving toward shore and cliff with their own lanterns in hand. For the first time in 5 years, Callum joined them, making his way down the path to the small cove directly beneath his cottage. It was a private spot, sheltered by rocks and rarely visited by others, though clearly visible from the main beach. The tide was coming in, waves washing gently over the pebbled shore. He waited until the sun had almost disappeared, casting long shadows across the water and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to echo the blue of his lantern. With hands that had steadied themselves through years of sailing rough seas, he lit the candle within the lantern. The blue panels glowed immediately, casting cobalt patterns across the rocks and sand. The woodwork threw precisely carved shadows, stars, waves, what might have been faces or memories. Callum closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel the full weight of the moment, the wish he had carried for 5 years, the words he had never spoken, the release he was finally granting, not just to Elaine's memory, but to himself. "I should have told you," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the waves. "I should have found the words while you could hear them. But perhaps you always knew, even without my saying it." He opened the small drawer Elsie had built into the lantern's base and placed inside a second wish he had written that afternoon. "Let me learn to live fully in your absence, not despite it, but because of it. Let me carry forward what you taught me about love being greater than presence or absence, stronger than life or death." Then he waded into the shallows and released the lantern. It bobbed for a moment, adjusting to the water's movement, then began to drift steadily outward with the receding wave. Unlike most sea-launched lanterns which followed the currents, this one seemed to chart its own course, moving directly toward the sunset's last glow on the horizon. Callum stood in the gentle surf until the lantern was only a distant point of blue against the darkening sky. As it finally disappeared from sight, a sense of peace settled over him, not the absence of grief, but its transformation into something lighter, more bearable. The walk back to his cottage felt different, as if some invisible burden had been set down along the way. In the growing darkness, other lanterns rose above Windmere, yellow, white, red, each carrying its own silent message into the night. That night, Callum dreamed of Elaine. Unlike previous dreams where she appeared as she had in illness or as a distant memory, this time she was present, immediate. She wore the blue dress she had favoured in summer, her copper hair loose around her shoulders. They stood together on an unfamiliar shore, though it felt like home. She didn't speak, but her smile held all the recognition and love he had feared lost. When she reached out to touch his face, his hand, her fingers were warm and solid. Not a ghost, not a memory, but something in between, real in the way that mattered most. He woke with tears on his face, but they weren't the bitter tears of loss. Instead, they carried the strange sweetness of connection rediscovered, of a conversation finally completed across the ultimate distance. Outside his window, the fog had returned. Not the heavy blanket of previous weeks, but a gentle mist that softened the morning light. He watched it curl around the trees and rocks, filling the hollows of the landscape, and thought perhaps he understood its purpose now. Some barriers were also bridges, some separations created new forms of closeness, and sometimes the most important words were those that transcended ordinary speech, finding their way through other channels, lanterns, dreams, the passage of light through fog. Later that morning, he found a single sea lavender bloom on his doorstep, though it wasn't the season for them yet. In town, people nodded to him with a new kind of recognition, not just appreciation for the wishes he wrote for them, but acknowledgement of his own journey now visible in his face. The lantern box contained 3 new requests, and he fulfilled them with a lighter heart than before. The words came more easily, flowing from something that had unlocked within him. And when evening came again, he watched the lanterns rise without the old ache, seeing in each one not loss, but possibility. Chapter 5. What I Never Wrote. The morning arrived with unexpected clarity. For the first time in weeks, the fog had retreated, revealing a sky so intensely blue it almost hurt to look at it. The town below Callum's cottage gleamed in the sunlight, rooftops and window panes flashing like signals. He took his morning tea on the porch, enjoying the warmth on his face and the unobstructed view of the harbour. Ships moved in and out with cheerful efficiency, making up for time lost during the foggy spell. Children ran along the shore, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. It was, by any measure, a perfect summer day in Windmere. And yet Callum found himself oddly unsettled by the absence of the fog. He had grown accustomed to its softening presence, its way of creating intimate spaces within the larger landscape. Without it, everything seemed slightly too sharp, too exposed. After breakfast, he checked the lantern box and found it empty for the first time in weeks. Perhaps the sunshine had temporarily suspended the town's need for wishes, or perhaps the collective ceremony in the square had satisfied some deeper hunger. With no wishes to write, Callum turned to practical matters, weeding his small garden, repairing a loose step on his porch, sorting through a box of old navigational instruments he'd been meaning to clean and oil. It was while searching for a specific tool in his sea chest that he found the journal, not his current one, but an older volume, its leather cover cracked and salt-stained. He recognized it immediately as the one he'd kept during Elaine's final illness, though he hadn't opened it since her passing. He set it aside, intending to return it to the chest, but something about the day's clarity seemed to demand equal honesty from him. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up again and carried it to his desk. The journal fell open naturally to the last entry, dated 5 years earlier, the day after Elaine's funeral. The page contained only a few lines in a handwriting less steady than his usual script. She's gone. The house empty. Cannot think beyond this moment. Cannot imagine the next hour, much less tomorrow. I should have told her.
The sentence broke off there, the rest of the page blank. Callum stared at it, remembering how he'd sat at this same desk, pen poised, unable to complete the thought. Not because he didn't know what he should have told her, but because writing it would make his failure permanent, irrevocable.
He turned back through the pages, reading entries from the months of Elaine's decline. They were sparse, factual, medications administered, doctor's visits, changes in symptoms. Very little of his own feelings recorded, as if documenting them would somehow make her illness more real. Tucked between the pages near the end, he found something unexpected, a folded piece of paper, the kind used for lantern wishes, though yellowed with age. His hand trembled slightly as he opened it to find his own writing. Let me find the courage to tell her how completely she changed me. How the man I became was only possible because she saw who I could be. Let her know, even in leaving, she is not diminishing, but expanding. Ripples on water, light through fog. It was a wish he had written but never sent, never even shown to Elaine. He had composed it during her final days, intending to release it during the lantern ceremony. But when the moment came, he couldn't bring himself to join the others on the shore. Instead, he had stayed by her bedside, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The wish had remained unsent, unspoken, eventually forgotten within the pages of his journal, one final failure of courage when it mattered most. Callum sat for a long time with the paper in his hands, feeling the weight of words that had never found their recipient. All around him, the cottage was filled with morning sunlight, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Outside his window, Windmere continued its day, unaware of the small, private revelation taking place on the cliff. With sudden decision, Callum reached for his current journal and a fresh sheet of paper. On the new sheet, he carefully copied the old wish, his hand steadier now, despite the emotion behind the words. When he finished, he placed it on his desk and returned to the sea chest. From its depths, he retrieved a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl, a gift from Elaine on their 20th anniversary. Inside were mementos of their life together, the dried flower from her wedding bouquet, a smooth stone from the beach where they'd first met, the ribbon from her hair on the day he'd proposed. He added the original wish to these treasures and closed the box, returning it to the chest. Then he took the copy to the blue lantern that still waited on his table. The lantern was as beautiful as the day Elsie had given it to him, its wooden framework gleaming in the sunlight, its blue panels rich with colour. He carefully opened one side and placed the wish inside, then closed it again, running his fingers over the intricate carvings. Not yet, he thought. Not in this revealing sunlight. Some things belong to the twilight, to the space between day and night where transitions were possible. He spent the remainder of the day in a state of quiet anticipation, watching the sun's slow arc across the sky. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather on the western horizon, not threatening but substantial, promising a spectacular sunset. As the first golden light of evening slanted through his window, Callum lit a small candle and carried it and the blue lantern out to his porch. The town below was preparing for its nightly ritual, figures moving toward shore and cliff with their own lanterns in hand. For the first time in 5 years, Callum joined them, making his way down the path to the small cove directly beneath his cottage. It was a private spot, sheltered by rocks and rarely visited by others, though clearly visible from the main beach. The tide was coming in, waves washing gently over the pebbled shore. He waited until the sun had almost disappeared, casting long shadows across the water and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to echo the blue of his lantern. With hands that had steadied themselves through years of sailing rough seas, he lit the candle within the lantern. The blue panels glowed immediately, casting cobalt patterns across the rocks and sand. The woodwork threw precisely carved shadows, stars, waves, what might have been faces or memories. Callum closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel the full weight of the moment, the wish he had carried for 5 years, the words he had never spoken, the release he was finally granting, not just to Elaine's memory, but to himself. "I should have told you," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the waves. "I should have found the words while you could hear them. But perhaps you always knew, even without my saying it." He opened the small drawer Elsie had built into the lantern's base and placed inside a second wish he had written that afternoon. "Let me learn to live fully in your absence, not despite it, but because of it. Let me carry forward what you taught me about love being greater than presence or absence, stronger than life or death." Then he waded into the shallows and released the lantern. It bobbed for a moment, adjusting to the water's movement, then began to drift steadily outward with the receding wave. Unlike most sea-launched lanterns which followed the currents, this one seemed to chart its own course, moving directly toward the sunset's last glow on the horizon. Callum stood in the gentle surf until the lantern was only a distant point of blue against the darkening sky. As it finally disappeared from sight, a sense of peace settled over him. Not the absence of grief, but its transformation into something lighter, more bearable. The walk back to his cottage felt different, as if some invisible burden had been set down along the way. In the growing darkness, other lanterns rose above Windmere, yellow, white, red, each carrying its own silent message into the night. That night, Callum dreamed of Elaine. Unlike previous dreams where she appeared as she had in illness, or as a distant memory, This time she was present, immediate. She wore the blue dress she had favoured in summer, her copper hair loose around her shoulders. They stood together on an unfamiliar shore, though it felt like home. She didn't speak, but her smile held all the recognition and love he had feared lost. When she reached out to touch his face, his hand, her fingers were warm and solid. Not a ghost, not a memory, but something in between, real, in the way that mattered most. He woke with tears on his face, but they weren't the bitter tears of loss. Instead, they carried the strange sweetness of connection rediscovered, of a conversation finally completed across the ultimate distance. Outside his window, the fog had returned, not the heavy blanket of previous weeks, but a gentle mist that softened the morning light. He watched it curl around the trees and rocks, filling the hollows of the landscape, and thought perhaps he understood its purpose now. Some barriers were also bridges, some separations created new forms of closeness, and sometimes the most important words were those that transcended ordinary speech, finding their way through other channels, lanterns, dreams, the passage of light through fog. Later that morning, he found a single sea lavender bloom on his doorstep, though it wasn't the season for them yet. In town, people nodded to him with a new kind of recognition, not just appreciation for the wishes he wrote for them, but acknowledgement of his own journey now visible in his face. The lantern box contained 3 new requests, and he fulfilled them with a lighter heart than before. The words came more easily, flowing from something that had unlocked within him. And when evening came again, he watched the lanterns rise without the old ache, seeing in each one not loss, but possibility. Chapter 6. The Festival of Lost Wishes. Summer deepened, bringing warmer days and briefer nights to Windmere. The peculiar fog persisted, though it had settled into a predictable pattern. Thick in early morning, thinning by midday, returning at twilight to embrace the lantern ceremony before dissipating into the darkness. Callum continued writing wishes, though the daily requests had stabilized at a manageable number. The task had become a cherished routine rather than an obligation, something he looked forward to as a way of connecting with his neighbours and community. The blue lantern he had sent to sea never returned, though he sometimes thought he glimpsed its distinctive glow on the horizon on especially clear nights. Whether it was truly his, or merely a trick of starlight on water, he took comfort in the possibility of its continued journey. On the first day of August, Eleanor Pierce arrived at his cottage with an unusual request. The mayor looked uncharacteristically hesitant as she stood on his porch, declining his offer of tea. "The Festival of Lost Wishes is coming," she said without preamble. "The last day of summer, as always, but this year the town council thinks it should be different." Callum nodded, waiting. The festival was Windmere's oldest tradition, predating even the nightly lantern ceremonies. Once a year, as summer gave way to autumn, the entire town gathered for a night of celebration culminating in the release of hundreds of lanterns. Not individual wishes, but a collective farewell to the season and welcome to the next. "Different how?" he asked, when Eleanor didn't continue. She shifted slightly. "The central wish. Normally it's something traditional. Good harvest, safe harbour through winter storms, that sort of thing. But this year, with everything that's happened, the council thinks a new kind of wish is needed, and we would like you to write it."
Callum raised his eyebrows. "The central wish has always been the mayor's responsibility." "Traditions change," Eleanor said simply. "The town has changed. You've had a hand in that, whether you meant to or not."
He considered declining. The central wish was significant. It would be read aloud to the entire town, copied onto dozens of lanterns, remembered and discussed long after the festival ended. It carried a weight of responsibility he wasn't sure he wanted. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze told him this wasn't merely a ceremonial request. The town genuinely wanted his words, believed in them in a way that both humbled and motivated him. "I'll need time to consider it," he said, finally. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "The festival is 3 weeks away. Take the time you need." She turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and the children have asked if you would judge their lantern-making contest this year. It's the afternoon before the main celebration." This request was unexpected enough to make him chuckle. "The children asked for me specifically?" A rare smile crossed Eleanor's face. Elsie Harmon might have suggested it, but the others agreed quite enthusiastically. After she left, Callum sat on his porch for a long time, watching the town below. The request had stirred complicated feelings. On one hand, he was touched by the trust placed in him. On the other, he remained uncomfortable with the role he'd been assigned, some combination of elder, scribe, and reluctant mystic that didn't quite fit his conception of himself. Over the next week, he found himself collecting ideas for the central wish, jotting down phrases that occurred to him while gardening or walking along the cliffs. Nothing felt quite right, quite equal to the responsibility. The wishes he wrote for individuals came naturally, shaped by their specific needs and circumstances. But how to craft something that would speak to an entire community, that would capture this unusual moment in Windmere's long history? The answer began to form one evening as he watched the lanterns rise above the harbour. From his vantage point, he could see the whole arc of their journey, from the hands that released them to their eventual disappearance into sky or sea. Some shot upward with surprising speed, others drifted lazily, some hovered as if reluctant to leave. What struck him was not their individual paths, but the relationship between them, how they created a temporary constellation, a map of human hopes made briefly visible before dispersing again into the wider world. And wasn't that what Windmere itself was? A collection of individual lives, each on its own trajectory, yet forming together something larger, more significant than any single element could be. With this understanding as his foundation, Callum began to craft the central wish in earnest. He worked on it during quiet mornings, revising and refining, testing phrases against the rhythm of waves and wind. By the week before the festival, he had something he thought might serve, though he kept it to himself, not quite ready to share it even with those who had requested it. Meanwhile, preparations for the festival consumed the town. Lanterns of all shapes and sizes appeared in windows and doorways, waiting to be lit. The town square was transformed with garlands of dried flowers and sea glass that caught the light. Children practiced songs and small plays that would be performed during the celebration. The fog, as if sensing the importance of the occasion, grew thinner each day, revealing more of the summer sky and allowing the sun to warm Windmere's stone buildings and narrow streets. On the day before the festival, Callum made his way to the schoolhouse where the children's lantern contest was being held. He found himself genuinely curious about what they had created, these young people who had grown up with lanterns as a central part of their lives. The schoolyard was filled with tables displaying dozens of handcrafted lanterns, each representing hours of careful work. Children aged 6 to 16 hovered nearby, some nervous, others proudly explaining their creations to parents and friends. Elsie Harmon spotted him first, running over with an excitement that made him smile despite himself. "Mr. Gray, you came! Wait till you see what I made. It's not as good as the one Dad and I made for you, but I did this one all by myself."
She led him to a table where a small but intricate lantern sat. Unlike the traditional paper and bamboo constructions, hers was crafted from thin slices of sea glass held together with delicate wire. When she lit the candle inside, the glass glowed in shades of blue, green, and amber, casting coloured patterns on the table's surface.
"It's magnificent," Callum said, sincerely. "Where did you find so much sea glass?" Elsie beamed. "I've been collecting it all year. Dad helped me smooth the edges, but I designed the pattern myself. See? It's the lighthouse and the cliffs." Looking closer, Callum could indeed make out the suggestion of Windmere's familiar silhouette in the arrangement of the glass pieces. Very clever and beautiful. He spent the next hour examining each entry, listening to the children's explanations of their work. asking questions about their techniques and inspirations. Some had created traditional lanterns with paper and wood, others had experimented with shells, dried seaweed, even small mirrors that would reflect the flame in dazzling patterns. What struck him most was how seriously they all took the purpose of their creations. These weren't merely decorative objects, but vessels for wishes, carriers of hope. Even the youngest understood this function on some level, explaining how they had designed their lanterns to help the wish fly higher or make the light shine farther. When it came time to announce the winners, Callum found himself reluctant to rank the entries. Each represented something unique and valuable. After conferring briefly with Mr. Bennett, the schoolteacher, he decided on a different approach. "Before I name the winners," he said to the gathered children and parents, "I want to thank each of you for sharing your creations with me. A lantern is a very personal thing. It carries something of its maker into the world, and all of you have put pieces of yourselves into these works." He went on to highlight specific qualities in each entry: the most innovative use of materials, the most skillful construction, the most evocative design. By the time he finally announced the overall winners, Elsie among them for genuine craftsmanship rather than any favoritism, every child had received some form of recognition. As the gathering dispersed, Mr. Bennett approached him with a smile. "Well handled," the young teacher said, "though I hope you realize you've just set a precedent. Next year they'll expect the same treatment." Callum shrugged. "Perhaps by then they'll have found someone else to judge." "I wouldn't count on it," Bennett replied. "You've become quite central to Windmere, Mr. Gray, whether you intended to or not." This observation, echoing Eleanor's words, followed Callum as he walked home through the town. Everywhere, people were making final preparations for the evening's festival, hanging lanterns from trees and porches, setting up tables for the communal meal that would precede the main ceremony, children running through final rehearsals of their performances. It was strange to think of himself as central to any of this. He had spent so many years in self-imposed isolation, observing Windmere from a distance, that this new connectedness still felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable in its intimacy. And yet he couldn't deny the warmth it brought him, the sense of purpose that had been missing since Elaine's death. The wishes he wrote, the lanterns that carried them, the subtle changes they brought to individual lives and to the community as a whole, these had become not just activities, but meaningful work, perhaps the most meaningful of his life. As twilight approached, Callum changed into his best shirt and jacket, items rarely worn since his retirement from the sea. The central wish was folded carefully in his pocket, written on the finest paper he could find, his normally practical handwriting transformed into something more intentional, almost ceremonial. The town square was already filled when he arrived, lanterns glowing from every available surface, tables laden with food. The festival traditionally began with a shared meal as the sun set, followed by music and performances as darkness fell. Only then would the lanterns be lit and released, first the central wish, and then the hundreds of individual lights that would follow it into the night sky. Callum found himself welcomed warmly, offered a place at a table with Martin and Elsie Harmon, Ida Wells and several others who had become something like friends over the summer. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the passing of dishes prepared from summer's bounty: fresh fish, garden vegetables, berry pies, still warm from the oven. As the meal concluded and dusk deepened into true evening, Eleanor Pierce rose to address the gathering. Lantern light softened her usually stern features as she welcomed everyone to the Festival of Lost Wishes. "We call it this," she explained, primarily for the benefit of a few summer visitors who had stayed for the celebration. "Not because the wishes themselves are lost, but because they help us find what we have lost: connection, hope, the ability to look beyond our immediate concerns to something larger." She spoke briefly about the history of the festival, its roots in Windmere's earliest days when the isolated community relied on such rituals to bind them together through the harsh coastal winters. Then, with a gesture that surprised no one but Callum himself, she invited him to join her. The square grew quiet as he made his way to her side. Faces turned toward him expectantly, children sitting cross-legged at the front, adults standing in respectful attention behind them. "This year," Eleanor continued, "the central wish has been entrusted to Callum Gray, whose words have already brought so much to our community. Callum, will you share the wish with us?" He nodded, suddenly dry-mouthed with a nervousness he hadn't felt since his first command at sea decades earlier. He unfolded the paper with careful deliberation, giving himself time to gather his thoughts. The central wish was traditionally read 3 times, once for the past, once for the present, once for the future. Callum drew a deep breath and began. "Let what is lost be found in new forms. Let absence become presence through memory and hope. Let each light recognize its connection to all others, creating constellations that guide us home." As the words hung in the air, a collective sigh moved through the gathering, as if a tension had been released. Callum repeated the wish, his voice stronger now, and by the 3rd reading, some in the crowd were quietly speaking along with him, the words already taking root in their minds and hearts. When he finished, Eleanor presented him with the central lantern, larger than the others, crafted by the town's most skilled artisans. It was a beautiful piece, its panels painted with scenes of Windmere through the seasons, its framework carved with symbols of sea and sky, memory and hope. Together they attached copies of the wish to its base, then lit the cluster of candles within. As was traditional, the entire town counted down from 10, their voices joining in a crescendo of anticipation. At 1, Callum and Eleanor released the lantern. It rose smoothly, purposefully, climbing above the square, above the town, above the cliffs and lighthouse, carrying Windmere's collective hopes into the night sky. What wasn't traditional was what happened next. As the central lantern ascended, the fog, which had been absent all day, returned in a rush, not from the sea or the moors, but from the sky itself. It descended in tendrils, wrapping around the lantern like curious fingers, illuminated from within by the candle's glow. Instead of obscuring the light, however, the fog seemed to amplify it, refracting the flame into ribbons of colour that stretched in all directions. The effect was like a sunset trapped in mist, or the northern lights brought down to earth, a phenomenon both beautiful and inexplicable. The crowd gasped, then fell silent in wonder. Even the youngest children stopped fidgeting, their faces turned upward in awe. For several minutes, the transformed lantern hovered above Windmere, painting the town in shifting hues of gold, rose, and violet. Then, slowly, the ribbons of light began to separate from the lantern itself, drifting outward like seeds from a dandelion. They floated down to touch rooftops, trees, the upturned faces of the watchers. Wherever they landed, they left brief traces of warmth and luminescence before fading. One such ribbon brushed Callum's cheek, and in that moment of contact he felt Elaine's presence more clearly than he had since her death, not as memory or grief, but as continuing connection, a love that transcended ordinary boundaries of time and presence. Looking around, he saw similar moments of recognition on other faces. Martin Harmon, his arm around Elsie's shoulders, tears streaming unashamedly down his bearded face. Ida Wells, her eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been song or prayer. Countless others, each experiencing their own private communion with what had been lost and was, briefly, found again. As the last ribbons of light dissipated, the central lantern resumed its normal appearance and continued its journey upward. The fog retreated as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the night clear and star-filled. A collective breath was released, followed by murmurs of amazement and attempts to describe what each had seen or felt. Eleanor, her usual composure visibly shaken, turned to Callum. "In 50 years," she said quietly, "I've never seen anything like that at the festival." He nodded, unable to find words for what had just occurred. It was as if the wish itself had manifested, transforming loss into new forms of presence, creating connections visible to the eye as well as the heart. The rest of the ceremony proceeded more normally. The children performed their plays, simple reenactments of local legends, and tales of lanterns that had supposedly granted extraordinary wishes. Musicians played traditional tunes that had accompanied the festival for generations, and finally, hundreds of individual lanterns were released, creating a river of light that flowed from Windmere into the vastness of sea and sky. Callum remained at the centre of it all, accepting thanks and wonder from his neighbours with a mixture of humility and quiet pride. What had happened wasn't his doing, he knew. It was something larger, something that belonged to Windmere itself, to its peculiar placement on the edge of land and sea, reality and dream. But his words had been the catalyst, the key that unlocked whatever door existed between the ordinary world and the mysterious one that sometimes shimmered just beyond perception. That knowledge filled him with a sense of purpose more profound than any he had known before. As the festival began to wind down, lanterns dwindling to distant points on the horizon, Callum slipped away from the crowd. He walked the familiar path to his cottage, but instead of going inside, he continued past it to the cliff's edge where a narrow trail led down to his private cove. The tide was out, revealing a crescent of sand, normally covered by the sea. He stood at the water's edge, listening to the gentle wash of waves, feeling the rhythmic pulse of ocean against shore that had been the backdrop to his entire life. Above him, the last of the festival lanterns were tiny sparks against the darkness. Tomorrow, Windmere would return to its ordinary routines, fishing boats launching before dawn, children at school, bread baking, life continuing in its measured way. But something had shifted permanently, both in the town and in himself. The lanterns had illuminated connections that had always existed, but had been forgotten or ignored. "Not bad for an old sailor," he said, quietly to the night, to Elaine, to whoever might be listening in the space between stars and sea. The only answer was the continued murmur of waves and the distant echo of celebration from the town. But it was enough, more than enough, to carry him back up the path toward home, toward tomorrow, toward whatever new wishes might be waiting to be written. Chapter 7. Light over Windmere. Autumn arrived in Windmere with its usual determination, bringing shorter days, crisper air, and seas that shifted from summer's blue tranquility to steel-grey turbulence. The cliffs caught the brunt of stronger winds, and Callum found himself adding extra logs to his fire in the evenings, the cottage filled with the fragrance of burning driftwood and pine. The lantern ceremonies continued despite the changing weather, though they moved earlier in the evening to accommodate the earlier sunsets. On especially stormy nights, they were held in the town square, rather than at the shore, the lanterns released to find their own paths, through rain and wind. Callum's wish-writing remained steady, though the content shifted with the season. Summer wishes had been full of exploration, new beginnings, tentative hopes. Autumn brought more reflective requests, wishes for endurance, for finding beauty in decline, for carrying summer's warmth through darker days. The most significant change came in Callum himself. The Festival of Lost Wishes had marked a turning point in his relationship with the town. He was no longer merely the solitary figure on the cliff who wrote wishes for others. He had become an active participant in Windmere's life. He joined the weekly gathering at the pub, where fishermen and merchants discussed everything from weather patterns to mainland politics. He helped with the repair of the community boathouse, damaged in an early autumn storm. He even agreed to visit the school occasionally, teaching the children traditional knots and navigation techniques that had served him during his seafaring years. Most remarkably, he had begun to accept dinner invitations from Martin and Elsie Harmon, from the Thorns, even from Eleanor Pierce, whose practical competence as mayor was matched by her surprising skill as a cook. These evenings were initially awkward, Callum unaccustomed to sustained social interaction, but gradually he found himself enjoying the simple pleasure of shared meals and unhurried conversation. On a particularly blustery evening in late October, as Callum returned from such a dinner at the lighthouse keeper's cottage, he noticed something unusual happening at the town square. A substantial crowd had gathered despite the lateness of the hour and the threatening weather. Curious, he altered his course to investigate. At the centre of the gathering stood a young woman he didn't recognize, clearly not a Windmere resident, given her urban clothing and the quality of her luggage, which sat beside her on the cobblestones. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair cut short around a pointed face. Her expression was a mixture of anxiety and determination. As Callum approached, he heard her explaining her situation to Eleanor and several town council members. "Never received any replies to my letters," she was saying. "Then we heard the steamship line had changed its schedule for the winter, so I decided to come directly. I realize it's unexpected." "Quite unexpected," Eleanor agreed, though not unkindly. "And as I've told you, there's no guest house in Windmere, especially this late in the season. The summer cottages are all closed for winter, and—" "She can stay with us," Elsie Harmon piped up from the edge of the group. "We have the extra room that used to be Mom's sewing room." Martin, standing beside his daughter, looked startled, but didn't contradict her. "We could make it up properly tomorrow," he said slowly. "For tonight, at least."
The young woman smiled gratefully. "That's incredibly kind. I promise I won't be a burden. I can pay for my board, of course."
Callum, his curiosity piqued, touched Eleanor's elbow. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. The mayor gave him a look that mingled exasperation and amusement. "This is Lucinda Morris," she said, "a writer from the mainland who's decided to grace us with her presence, unannounced, to study our fascinating lantern traditions for some book she's working on."
The young woman, Lucinda, overheard and turned toward them. "It's more than just a book," she said earnestly. "I'm documenting unique cultural practices from coastal communities before they're lost to modernization. Your lantern ceremonies are particularly notable. I've heard stories about them as far away as the capital."
Callum raised his eyebrows. "Stories? About our lanterns?" She nodded eagerly. "Sailors who've passed through Windmere speak of wishes that come true, lights that behave unlike normal fire, strange mists that show visions. Of course, I assumed much of it was exaggeration, but—" She gestured toward the nearest building, where several lanterns hung ready for the next evening's ceremony. "There does seem to be something special here." "You should talk to Callum," Elsie said, pointing at him with childish directness. "He writes the best wishes. They always work." Lucinda's gaze sharpened with interest as she studied him. "You're the wish writer? The one they call the lantern writer?"
Callum shifted uncomfortably. "I sometimes help people find the right words, yes."
"I have so many questions for you," she said, her professional enthusiasm momentarily overriding her fatigue from travel. "About the language you use, the intention behind it, whether you've observed patterns in which wishes seem most effective." "Perhaps tomorrow," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "After our guest has had a chance to rest, and we've all had time to consider the best way to accommodate her research." This gentle but clear dismissal was accepted by all. Martin and Elsie led Lucinda toward their home, her luggage carried by one of the younger fishermen who had been watching the exchange. The crowd dispersed, returning to their own houses as the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall. Eleanor remained with Callum in the rapidly emptying square. "What do you make of this?" she asked when they were alone. He considered the question. "I'm not sure. She seems sincere enough." "Sincerity isn't my concern," Eleanor replied. "Disruption is. Windmere has always kept its traditions private, not because they're secret, but because they belong to us. Having them written about, analysed, perhaps even sensationalised." Callum understood her worry. The lantern ceremonies had deepened and evolved in recent months, taking on meaning beyond their traditional role. They had become essential to the town's emotional well-being, a collective practice that defied simple explanation. "I doubt she'll find what she's looking for," he said. "The lanterns aren't a curiosity to be studied, they're something lived." Eleanor nodded, seemingly reassured. "Well, she'll discover that soon enough, and Windmere has weathered stranger visitors." She pulled her coat tighter as the rain intensified. "Good night, Callum. Stay dry if you can." He hurried back to his cottage as the storm strengthened, reaching his door just as thunder rumbled over the cliffs. Inside, he built up his fire and sat before it, thinking about the unexpected arrival and what it might mean for Windmere. The mainland often existed as an abstraction for most residents, a place where supplies came from, where children sometimes left for education or opportunity, but otherwise remote from daily life. Having a representative of that world suddenly among them, observing their most intimate traditions, felt like an intrusion into something sacred. And yet, Callum reflected, perhaps there was value in having an outsider's perspective. The lanterns and their effects had become so familiar to Windmere that they were hardly questioned anymore. Lucinda Morris, with her writer's curiosity, might see things they had missed, connections they had overlooked. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Callum found 3 notes in the lantern box, completed them with his usual care, then walked into town for supplies and, he admitted to himself, the chance to observe how Windmere was reacting to its visitor. In the bakery, the conversation revolved around little else. "Been here since dawn, she has," Mrs. Thorne informed him as she wrapped his bread. Asking questions about every lantern hanging in the square, taking notes in a little book. "Martin says she was up half the night writing by candlelight." "Elsie's quite taken with her," added another customer, "showing her all around town, introducing her to everyone." By midday, Callum had heard a dozen such reports, each slightly different, but all suggesting that Lucinda Morris was being thorough in her research. Some viewed this with suspicion, others with amusement, a few with pride that Windmere's customs were considered worthy of documentation. He was returning home when he encountered the subject of all this discussion, walking along the cliff path that led to his cottage. Elsie was with her, pointing out landmarks with proprietary enthusiasm. "And that's Mr. Gray's house," the girl was saying. "That's where people leave their wish requests, in the box on his porch. See it?" Lucinda nodded, jotting something in her notebook. She looked up as they drew closer, recognition lighting her face. "Mr. Gray, I was hoping to speak with you if you have time." Callum glanced at Elsie, who was practically bouncing with excitement at having facilitated this meeting. "I suppose I do," he said. "Would you like to come in? I've just put the kettle on." His cottage, which had seen more visitors in recent months than in the previous 5 years combined, accommodated 2 more without complaint. Elsie settled into the armchair with the familiarity of a frequent guest, while Lucinda perched on the edge of the wooden chair he offered, her notebook open on her knee. "I want to understand how the wish-writing began," she said after preliminary pleasantries. "Was it a revival of an older tradition or something entirely new?" Callum, preparing tea, considered how to answer. The simple version, that he had helped Elsie with a wish that seemed to affect her father's grief, felt too personal to share with a stranger. Yet there was a larger truth that belonged not just to him, but to the town. "It began with a need," he said finally. "Not mine, but someone else's. And then another need, and another. The lanterns were always here, always carrying wishes. I just found a way to help people express what they were already feeling." Lucinda wrote rapidly, her pencil scratching across the page. "And you've observed effects from these wishes? Actual changes resulting from them?" He handed her a cup of tea before taking his own seat. "I've observed that people find what they need, whether through the lanterns or through their own hearts opening to possibility. The distinction doesn't much matter to me. She looked up sharply. You don't believe the lanterns themselves have any unusual properties? Despite what others claim to have seen? Elsie interjected before he could answer. They're magic, she said with absolute conviction. Not like in stories with sparks and transformations, but magic still. They understand what you really need, even if you don't say it exactly right.
Callum smiled at her certainty. Elsie may be right. I've seen things I can't easily explain. We all have, here in Windmere. But whether that's magic or simply the power of collective belief, of shared ritual and intention, I couldn't say. Lucinda didn't look satisfied with this ambiguity, but she moved on to more specific questions about his process, the language he chose, how people responded to his words. He answered as honestly as he could, though several times he found himself redirecting when her queries touched on aspects that felt too intimate to examine under a researcher's gaze.
After an hour, Elsie grew restless. Can we go see the tidal pools now? She asked Lucinda. You said you wanted to see where the sea lanterns go when they sink. Of course, Lucinda replied, closing her notebook. Thank you for your time, Mr. Gray. I'd like to continue our conversation another day, if you're willing. He walked them to the door, aware that he had revealed less than she hoped, but perhaps more than he had intended. Something about her earnestness, her genuine curiosity, made him want to help her understand Windmere's relationship with the lanterns, even as he felt protective of its more ineffable qualities. You're welcome to return, he told her, though I'm not sure how much more insight I can offer. She smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. I've found that people often know more than they realize about the things they love. It's just a matter of asking the right questions. As they walked away, Elsie, chattering animatedly beside her, Callum watched them with mixed feelings. There was something appealing about Lucinda's intellectual passion, her determination to document and understand. But there was also something slightly disquieting about having Windmere's intimate customs examined as artifacts rather than lived experiences. That evening, he attended the lantern ceremony for the first time in several days. The weather had calmed enough to allow it to be held at the shore, and nearly the entire town was present, partly for the ritual itself, partly, he suspected, to see how their visitor would respond to it. Lucinda stood slightly apart from the others, notebook in hand, watching with intense concentration as each person prepared their lantern. No one had asked her to participate, and she made no move to do so, maintaining the observer's careful distance. Callum had written several wishes that day, and he watched as they were released, Mrs. Thorne's lantern drifting toward the lighthouse, the fishmongers rising straight up, as if pulled by invisible strings, two children's lanterns dancing around each other in spirals before separating toward different horizons. As the ceremony continued, he became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The fog, which had been absent since morning, began to gather, not the usual mist rolling in from sea or moor, but something that seemed to form directly around the lanterns themselves. Each light became surrounded by a halo of luminous vapor that shifted and swirled with its movements. The townspeople noticed but showed no alarm, accustomed now to the fog's strange behaviors. Lucinda, however, was visibly affected. She had stopped writing and stood transfixed, her notebook hanging forgotten at her side, her lips slightly parted in wonder. The effect intensified as more lanterns joined those already aloft. The individual halos began to connect, forming a network of glowing pathways above Windmere. Where they intersected, the fog thickened and brightened, creating nodes of light that pulsed with gentle radiance. Then the truly extraordinary occurred. One of the lanterns, Callum recognized it as containing a wish he had written for young Thomas Weller, who was leaving for university the next day, suddenly flared bright as a meteor. Its flame didn't consume the paper structure, but transformed, the fire ribboning outward in streams of gold and white. These ribbons arced through the fog network, illuminating the entire construction from within. The effect was like seeing a map of Windmere's collective hopes, each wish connected to others in patterns too complex to follow, but unmistakably meaningful. A sound rose from the gathered townspeople, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, but a shared exhalation of recognition. Many reached out as if to touch the spectacle, though it floated well above their heads. Others simply stood in reverent silence, faces uplifted and awash in the ethereal light. Callum found himself strangely moved, not just by the beauty of the phenomenon, but by its evident purpose. This wasn't random or merely atmospheric, it was communication of some kind, a visual representation of how individual wishes formed a greater whole, how each person's hopes were supported and amplified by others. He glanced at Lucinda and saw that she had abandoned all pretense of documentation. Her notebook had fallen to the sand, and tears streaked her face as she watched the luminous display. Whatever skepticism or academic distance she had maintained was gone, replaced by raw wonder. The vision, for Callum could think of it as nothing else, lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the ribbons of light slowly retracted to their source. The fog network dispersed, individual halos returning to their respective lanterns, which continued their journeys at a more measured pace. As the spectacle faded, the silence that had fallen over the gathering gave way to murmurs of amazement, attempts to describe what each had seen or felt. Some embraced, others stood in continued awe. A few began singing softly, an old Windmere melody that spoke of light guiding sailors home. Lucinda remained apart, seeming almost dazed as she bent to retrieve her fallen notebook. When she straightened, her eyes met Callum's across the crowd. In that moment of connection, he saw that she understood something essential, that what she had witnessed couldn't be fully captured in words, couldn't be analyzed or explained away. It could only be experienced, and even then, never completely understood. Later that night, as Callum sat on his porch watching the last of the lanterns disappear over the horizon, he heard footsteps on the path. Lucinda appeared from the darkness, her face pale in the moonlight, her notebook clutched against her chest. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the step beside him. He nodded, and she sat, both of them gazing out at the sea, for several minutes before she spoke again. "I came to Windmere thinking I would document a quaint local custom," she said finally. "Something charming but ultimately explicable. I didn't expect—" She trailed off, clearly struggling to articulate her experience. "Few do," Callum replied. "Even those of us who have lived here all our lives are still surprised by what the lanterns reveal."
She turned to look at him directly. "What was that, Mr. Gray? What did we see tonight?"
He considered various answers, scientific, mystical, philosophical, before settling on the simplest truth. Connection, the visible form of invisible ties, the lanterns showing us what's always there but rarely seen. Lucinda was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. "I don't know how to write about this," she admitted. "Any attempt to analyze or categorize what I saw feels reductive, almost disrespectful." "Perhaps you're approaching it from the wrong direction," Callum suggested. "Instead of trying to explain the lanterns, you might explore how they've affected Windmere. The changes in people, in relationships, in the town itself." She nodded slowly. "A human story rather than a supernatural one." "They're not really separate," he said. "That's what the lanterns show us, I think. The human and the mysterious, intertwined." They sat in companionable silence until the moon was high overhead, the village below dark except for a few windows still glowing with lamplight. When Lucinda finally rose to leave, she seemed calmer, the frenetic energy of the researcher replaced by something more reflective. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the perspective, and for your patience with my questions." "Will you continue your research?" he asked. She smiled ruefully. "I think I've been researching the wrong thing. But yes, I'll continue, though perhaps with a different approach. After she had gone, Callum remained on his porch, thinking about the evening's display and what it might signify. The lanterns had never behaved quite that way before, creating such an elaborate and beautiful pattern. Was it coincidence that it happened during Lucinda's visit? Or had the lanterns themselves chosen to reveal more of their nature to someone who sought to understand them? Either way, he felt that something important had shifted, not just for their visitor, but for Windmere itself. The town had witnessed its own interconnectedness made visible, its web of wishes and hopes illuminated by something that transcended ordinary explanation. Whatever Lucinda eventually wrote about Windmere, whether her book found an audience or not, tonight's revelation would continue to work within the community, reinforcing the bonds that the lanterns had been strengthening all along. And perhaps that was the true purpose of her unexpected arrival, not to document Windmere's traditions for the outside world, but to help the town see itself more clearly, to recognize the extraordinary within the seemingly ordinary rhythm of their days and nights beside the sea. Chapter 8. The Return. The weeks following the remarkable lantern display brought change to Windmere. Winter was approaching, announced by frost on morning window panes and early sunsets that painted the sea in deepening shades of violet and indigo. The fishing fleet returned from its final seasonal expedition, boats secured in the harbour for the coming storms, nets hung to dry and repair in boathouses and barns. Lucinda Morris remained in Windmere longer than anyone had expected, moving from the Harmons' spare room to a small cottage on the edge of town that had been vacated when its elderly owner relocated to the mainland to live with her daughter. The arrangement was temporary but open-ended. She would stay through winter at least, continuing her research and gradually integrating into the community, not just as an observer, but as a tentative participant. Callum's routine adjusted to the season as well. The lantern box remained on his porch, though frost sometimes rimmed its edges, and the notes inside were occasionally dampened by snow or sleet. He wrote fewer wishes, winter being a time of conservation rather than expansion in Windmere, but those he did craft carried greater weight. Hopes to sustain families through the lean months, to protect those who still ventured onto the sea in milder weather, to preserve connections when harsh conditions kept neighbours apart. The lantern ceremonies continued despite the cold, though they were often briefer, focused on necessity rather than celebration. On the worst nights, when wind and snow made outdoor gatherings impossible, people would place their lanterns in windows instead, creating a constellation of lights throughout the town that served as both practical illumination and spiritual comfort. On a particularly bitter evening in early December, Callum sat before his fire, working on a complex wish for the town's midwife. She had requested words that might comfort a young couple whose first child had been born too early and now struggled for life. It was the kind of wish that required careful consideration, acknowledging harsh reality while nurturing fragile hope, finding language that could contain both possibility and preparation for loss. He was deep in thought when a knock came at his door, sharp and urgent despite the howling wind outside. Opening it, he found Martin Harmon on his step, snow dusting his shoulders and beard, his expression uncharacteristically agitated. "You're needed in town," Martin said without preamble. "There's something... You should see it for yourself." Concerned, Callum quickly donned his heavy coat and boots, following Martin down the path that led toward Windmere. The night was frigid, the wind cutting through layers of wool, the narrow trail made treacherous by patches of ice. They walked in silence, save for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and Martin's occasional warning about difficult footing ahead. Rather than entering the town proper, Martin led them toward the northern beach, the same stretch of shore where Ida Wells had released her lantern and sung for the first time in 15 years. As they descended the wooden steps to the sand, Callum saw a cluster of figures gathered at the water's edge, lanterns held aloft to combat the darkness. Drawing closer, he recognized Eleanor Pierce, Mr. Bennett the schoolteacher, Jeremiah from the lighthouse, and several others, members of the town council and respected elders. They stood in a semicircle around something Callum couldn't yet see, their faces illuminated by lantern light and etched with expressions of wonder and uncertainty. Eleanor turned at their approach. "Callum, thank you for coming. We weren't sure what to make of this, but we thought you should be here." She stepped aside, allowing him to see what had drawn them to the beach on such an inhospitable night. There, resting on the sand just beyond the tide's reach, was a lantern, not one of Windmere's typical paper and bamboo constructions, but a distinctive blue lantern with an intricate wooden framework carved in patterns of stars and waves. His lantern, the one he had sent to sea months ago, carrying his unspoken wish for Elaine. It should have been impossible. The delicate structure should have been destroyed by the elements, the paper dissolved, the wood rotted or broken. Yet here it was, intact and, most incredibly, still glowing with a steady blue flame that seemed impervious to the wind that howled around them. Callum stepped forward slowly, scarcely believing what he saw. As he knelt beside the lantern, he could see that it was indeed the same one. The distinctive carvings Elsie and Martin had created, the small drawer in its base, even the slight scorch mark on one panel where the candle had initially burned too close to the paper. "How?" he asked, though he expected no answer. "It washed ashore less than an hour ago," Jeremiah said. "I saw it from the lighthouse. Thought it was a signal light at first, moving too steadily to be a normal lantern. By the time I got down here, others had noticed it too. It came straight in," Eleanor added, "not drifting with the tide, but moving with purpose, like it knew where it was going." Callum reached out tentatively to touch the lantern. It was cool despite the flame within, and completely dry, as if it had never been immersed in seawater at all. When his fingers made contact with the wooden frame, a strange sensation passed through him, not quite a shock, but a recognition, a resonance that seemed to vibrate in his bones. "There's something inside," Martin said quietly. "Besides the candle, I mean. We didn't open it, thought it should be you."
Focusing more closely, Callum saw what Martin meant. The small drawer at the lantern's base was slightly ajar, a corner of folded paper visible within. With fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, he carefully pulled the drawer open and removed the paper. It was not the wish he had written, which should have burned long ago in any case. This was something new, a message written in a flowing hand he didn't recognize.
"Thank you for giving my wish words when I couldn't." "L," he read it again, then looked up at the expectant faces surrounding him. "It's a thank you," he said simply, unwilling to share the signature that could mean everything or nothing at all. Eleanor nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The lanterns always return what we need, though rarely so literally." No one questioned this assertion, nor did they ask to see the note themselves. In Windmere, some privacies were still respected, even amid communal wonder. "What will you do with it?" Mr. Bennet asked after a moment. Callum considered the question, looking at the blue flame that continued to burn despite all natural laws that should have extinguished it. "Take it home," he said finally. "Where it belongs." The group dispersed shortly after, returning to the relative warmth of their homes, leaving Callum and Martin to make the journey back up the cliff path. Martin insisted on accompanying him, concerned about the treacherous conditions and perhaps curious about the lantern's significance, though he asked no direct questions. When they reached Callum's cottage, Martin paused at the door. "Will you be all right?" he asked, eyeing the lantern that still glowed with its impossible blue light. Callum nodded. "I think so. It's a good kind of unsettlement, if that makes sense."
Martin smiled faintly beneath his beard. "Most important things are unsettling at first. Good night, then."
Alone, Callum placed the lantern on his desk and sat before it, studying its steady flame and the way it painted his familiar surroundings in shades of blue and shadow. The note lay beside it, innocuous yet profound in its implications. Thank you for giving my wish words when I couldn't. LL for Lucinda, a simple coincidence of initials. But no, the young writer had never asked him to craft a wish for her, though she had witnessed many of his words carried in others' lanterns. L for lantern, perhaps. A personification of the object itself, returning with its own message. Or, and here his heart constricted with a hope so fragile he scarcely dared acknowledge it, L for Elaine. He had written his wish for her after all, words he hadn't been able to speak while she lived. Was it so impossible to imagine her reaching back across whatever distance separated them, acknowledging his belated message? In a place where lanterns defied natural laws and fog carried visions, could this not also be true? Callum sat with these questions until the fire in his hearth burned low and the wind outside subsided to a whisper. The lantern's flame never flickered, never diminished, casting its blue light in a perfect circle that seemed to hold him within a moment outside ordinary time. Eventually, he moved the lantern to his bedside table and lay down, not expecting sleep, but finding it nonetheless, drawn under by the gentle rhythm of the flame's pulsing light. He dreamed of Elaine, not as she had been in illness, or as the fog figure he had glimpsed, but as she might exist now, ageless, complete, herself, but freed from physical constraints. She sat beside him on a beach he didn't recognize, their hands almost, but not quite touching on the sand between them. The words were always there, she told him, her voice as clear as it had been in life. In your heart, in your actions. But there is power in making them explicit, in sending them out into the world. Was it really you, he asked, the note in the lantern? She smiled, the expression achingly familiar. Does it matter? What matters is that you found a way to say what needed saying, and in doing so, helped others find their own voices. Before he could respond, the dream shifted. They were standing at the edge of a fog bank that stretched infinitely in all directions. Pinpricks of light moved within it. Lanterns, he realized, hundreds of them, carrying wishes he had written and others he hadn't, all interconnected in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. This is what you've helped create, Elaine said, gesturing toward the luminous network. Not just for Windmere, but beyond. Words finding their way to where they're needed most. I didn't intend any of this, he admitted. I only wanted to help one child with her wish. The most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of kindness. She turned to face him fully. I have to go now, but I'm never far. The fog connects everything if you know how to see through it. He woke with the first light of dawn, the dreams still vivid in his mind. The blue lantern continued to burn beside him, its flame no lesser for the hours that had passed. Outside his window, the usual morning fog clung to the cliffs and town below, but now he saw it differently, not as an obscuring force, but as a medium of connection, a visual reminder of invisible bonds. Over the following days, Callum found himself returning to the dream and the lantern's message, finding new meanings each time he considered them. He kept the blue lantern on his desk as he wrote wishes for others, its light a constant companion to his work. Word of the returned lantern spread through Windmere, of course. In a small town where few secrets remained so for long, the story was too remarkable not to share. People viewed it as further confirmation of what many already believed, that the lanterns operated according to principles beyond ordinary understanding, that they formed connections that transcended time and space. Lucinda Morris, when she heard the tale, approached it with the careful balance she had developed between scholarly interest and respect for mystery. She interviewed those who had been present on the beach, documented the event in her ever-present notebook, but asked no invasive questions about the message the lantern had carried. Some things belong to story rather than analysis, she told Callum when they discussed it over tea in his cottage. I'm learning to recognize the difference. As winter deepened, bringing the shortest days and longest nights of the year, the blue lantern became a fixture in Windmere's collective awareness. People spoke of seeing its light from the town below, a steady blue beacon on the cliff that somehow brought comfort during the harshest weather. Children created stories about it, tales of a sailor's lantern that had travelled the world before finding its way home, of wishes so powerful they transformed into light that could never be extinguished. Callum himself came to see it as neither miracle nor message, exactly, but as a reminder of continuity, the ongoing conversation between presence and absence, between what was lost and what remained. Whether the initial L represented Elaine or something else entirely mattered less than the connection it affirmed, the circle it completed. On the longest night of the year, as Windmere celebrated the winter solstice with its own lantern ceremony, one that acknowledged darkness while looking toward returning light, Callum stood on his porch and watched the town below. From his vantage point, he could see the entire arc of the celebration, from the gathering in the square to the lighting of lanterns to their release into the night sky.
The fog had returned in force, wrapping Windmere in its now familiar embrace, but rather than obscuring the lanterns, it enhanced them, each light surrounded by a halo of luminous mist that stretched and connected with others, creating once again that visible network of hopes and intentions.
As he watched, Callum became aware of movement beside him, not a person, but a thickening of the fog that gradually assumed a more defined shape. It was too indistinct to call a figure, more an impression of presence, a sense of being not alone. He didn't turn to look directly at it, instinctively understanding that to do so might cause it to dissipate. Instead, he spoke quietly to the night air, his words meant for whoever or whatever might be listening. The fog is clearing, isn't it? Not just around Windmere, but here. He touched his chest, where it matters most. The presence beside him seemed to pulse slightly, like a heartbeat translated into mist. He felt, rather than heard a response, a sense of affirmation, of peaceful acknowledgement. They remained that way as the lanterns continued to rise from the town below, each following its own path, yet part of a greater whole. It was, Callum realized, what he had been moving toward all these months. Not the absence of grief, but its transformation into a different kind of connection, one that recognized separation while refusing to be defined by it. Eventually, the presence beside him thinned and dispersed, returning to the greater fog that enveloped the cliffs. But Callum didn't feel abandoned or alone. Rather, he sensed that the distinction between presence and absence had somehow become less absolute, the boundaries between them more permeable than he had once believed. Inside his cottage, the blue lantern continued to burn with its steady flame, illuminating his desk where tomorrow's wishes waited to be written. Beyond his window, the Lanterns of Windmere traced their paths through fog and darkness, carrying the town's collective hopes toward horizons seen and unseen. And somewhere between these visible manifestations of connection lay the truth Callum had been learning all along, that loss, properly honoured, could become a doorway rather than an ending. That words, carefully chosen, could bridge distances once thought impassable. That light, however small, could transform even the deepest fog into something beautiful and navigable. The understanding settled in him not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty, a foundation upon which to build whatever days remained to him. He would continue writing wishes for others, not because they were magic, but because they mattered, because giving voice to hope was itself an act of creation, of resistance against isolation and despair. The lanterns would rise, the fog would come and go, and through it all, Windmere would remain what it had always been, a community on the edge of ordinary reality, where the boundaries between the seen and unseen, the present and the absent, were thin enough to allow passage in both directions. Chapter 9. A Quiet Light. Spring returned to Windmere in fits and starts, warm days followed by bitter reminders of winter, delicate flowers pushing through snow, ice breaking up in the harbour to reveal glimpses of dark water beneath. The town emerged from its seasonal hibernation with the practiced rhythm of a community accustomed to nature's gradual transitions. Fishing boats were recommissioned, gardens turned and planted, roofs repaired after winter storms. Children who had been confined indoors for months ran wild along the shore, collecting shells and sea glass, building elaborate structures in the sand only to watch the tide reclaim them. The lantern ceremonies evolved with the season, becoming less about survival and more about renewal. Wishes shifted accordingly. Hopes for successful voyages, bountiful gardens, new beginnings of all kinds. The fog, which had been a constant presence through winter, grew more intermittent as spring advanced, appearing primarily at twilight to escort the lanterns on their journey. Callum's role in Windmere's life had stabilized into something both acknowledged and unobtrusive. He continued writing wishes for those who asked, though he was selective now, accepting requests only when he felt he had something meaningful to contribute, when the right words were genuinely needed rather than merely convenient. The blue lantern remained on his desk, its flame unwavering despite the passage of months. He had stopped questioning its impossible persistence, accepting it as one more manifestation of the quiet magic that seemed to inhabit Windmere. Some visitors to his cottage remarked on it, others seemed not to notice it at all, as if it existed in a slightly different reality, accessible only to those prepared to perceive it. On a mild evening in late April, as Callum sat on his porch watching the first stars appear above the fading sunset, he noticed a solitary figure making its way up the cliff path toward his cottage. As it drew closer, he recognized Lucinda Morris, her short, dark hair now streaked with strands of premature silver, her urban clothing replaced by the more practical garb of a Windmere resident. She had changed in other ways during her months in the town, the frenetic energy of the professional researcher giving way to a more measured pace, her analytical approach tempered by an appreciation for mystery. She still took notes, still asked questions, but with the understanding that some answers would forever elude precise documentation. "Good evening," she called as she approached the porch. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Callum gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Not at all. Just watching the day end." She settled into the offered seat with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had visited often enough to feel welcome. "The town looks peaceful from up here." "It usually does, regardless of what storms might be brewing below." They sat in companionable silence for a time, observing as lights began to appear in windows, as the first lanterns of the evening were prepared for release. After several minutes, Lucinda spoke again, her tone casual but her words carefully chosen. "I finished my book, or at least the first draft of it." Callum turned to look at her. "Congratulations, that's quite an accomplishment." She nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. "It's very different from what I originally envisioned. Less anthropological study, more... I'm not sure what to call it. A meditation on connection, perhaps. On the ways communities create meaning together." "And the lanterns? How did you write about them?"
"As honestly as I could," she replied, "which means acknowledging their effects without attempting to explain them. Documenting what I saw while respecting what remains unseen." She smiled slightly. Not the most academically rigorous approach, but the only one that felt true to my experience here.
Callum nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "When will it be published?" "That's actually what I came to talk about." Lucinda shifted in her chair, facing him more directly. "Before I submit it to my publisher, I wanted your opinion, yours and the town council's. Windmere has given me so much, and the last thing I want is to repay that generosity with an account that feels invasive or reductive." "I'm honoured by the consideration," Callum said, "though I'm no literary critic." I'm not looking for critique of the writing, she clarified. More a sense of whether I've captured something authentic about Windmere, about the lanterns, whether the work feels respectful of what matters most to this community. It was a request that reflected how much she had come to understand about the town, its pride, its privacy, its complex relationship with traditions that defied easy explanation. The Lucinda who had arrived last autumn would never have thought to ask such permission. The Lucinda who sat beside him now couldn't imagine proceeding without it. I'd be happy to read it, Callum told her, and I'm sure Eleanor and the council will appreciate the opportunity as well. She reached into the bag she carried and withdrew a thick manuscript bound with twine. Here it is, the only copy outside my own notes. Take as long as you need. He accepted the manuscript, feeling the weight of trust it represented. And after this, will you return to the mainland, to academic life? The question hung between them, more significant than its casual delivery suggested. Lucinda had become part of Windmere's fabric over the past months, helping in the library 2 days a week, teaching the older children about mainland history and literature, participating in the lantern ceremonies with growing ease. Her departure would leave a noticeable absence. I've been offered a teaching position at the university, she said after a moment, starting in the autumn term, but... She looked out toward the horizon, where the last colours of sunset were fading into deeper blue. I'm considering declining it, or at least negotiating for a later start date. Oh? Callum kept his tone neutral, though he felt a surprising pleasure at the implication. There's more to learn here, she said simply. More to experience. And I've found that Windmere suits me in ways the city never did. The pace, the connection to natural rhythms, the sense of being part of something. She gestured vaguely, searching for the right word. Sacred? Callum suggested. She nodded, unembarrassed by the term that might once have seemed too mystical for her scholarly sensibilities. Yes, sacred, though not in any conventional religious sense. Sacred in its attention to what connects us, to the thin places where ordinary reality reveals its extraordinary substrate. Below them, the first lanterns of the evening were being released from the shore. They rose with characteristic grace, each following its own path, yet somehow in harmony with the others, creating an emergent pattern that couldn't have been planned, but seemed nonetheless intentional. I understand, Callum said, and he did, perhaps better than most. Windmere has a way of claiming those who are open to it. They watched the lanterns in silence until full darkness had settled over the town and sea. Then Lucinda rose, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I should get back before the path becomes too difficult to navigate, she said. But there's one more thing I wanted to ask you. Callum waited, curious. Would you write a wish for me? Not for the book or for my research, but for myself. I've never asked before because it seemed presumptuous, but now... She hesitated. Now it feels right. He studied her in the dim light from his cottage window, seeing the journey she had taken from observer to participant, from documenter to community member. I'd be honoured, he said. Do you have a specific wish in mind? She shook her head. I think that's where your gift lies, in finding the wishes we haven't fully articulated, even to ourselves. Leave a note in the box tomorrow, he told her. I'll have something for you by evening. After Lucinda had gone, Callum remained on the porch, thinking about her request and what it signified. She was right. He hadn't perceived her as someone who needed his words until now. Her academic certainty, her outsider's perspective, had created a kind of barrier that made genuine connection difficult. But that had changed gradually, and then suddenly, just as it had for him when Elsie first appeared on his doorstep, seeking help with her wish. The moment of asking marked a threshold crossed, an acknowledgement of mutual trust and vulnerability. The next morning, he found Lucinda's note in the lantern box. a simple request written in her precise hand, a wish for whatever comes next. LM. He spent the day considering what words might serve her best, what hopes might lie beneath her current transition. By afternoon, sitting at his desk with the blue lantern casting its steady light over his work, he had crafted something that felt right, not perfect perhaps, but true to what he sensed of her journey. On a slip of his finest paper, he wrote, "Let the stories you've gathered here become seeds for those yet unwritten. Let the mystery you've witnessed remind you that explanation is never the final word. And when the time comes to choose between safe harbors and open seas, may you find the courage to set sail toward horizons that call your name." That evening, he joined the lantern ceremony at the shore for the first time in several weeks. Lucinda was there, standing slightly apart from the main group, a simple but elegant lantern in her hands. When she saw him approaching, her face brightened with surprise and pleasure. "I didn't expect you to deliver it personally," she said. He handed her the folded wish. Some occasions warrant breaking routine. She read the words carefully, her expression softening as she absorbed their meaning. Without comment, she placed the paper inside her lantern and lit the candle within. Its glow illuminated her face from below, emphasizing the quiet determination in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for this and for everything else." They stood, side by side, as others around them released their lanterns, each following its appointed path into the gathering darkness. When Lucinda's turn came, she held her light a moment longer than strictly necessary, as if committing its warmth to memory. Then, with a gentle motion, she released it to the evening breeze. The lantern rose steadily, neither racing upward nor drifting aimlessly, but following a deliberate trajectory that carried it toward the eastern horizon. As it ascended, the fog, which had been notably absent for several days, suddenly appeared around it, not as the usual diffuse mist, but as a clearly defined spiral that wrapped the light in luminous coils. The effect was striking enough that several people gasped or pointed. The spiral tightened around the lantern, seeming almost to cradle it, then expanded outward in ripples that touched several other lanterns floating nearby. Where these ripples intersected, small bursts of multicolored light appeared, like miniature fireworks suspended in the mist. "I've never seen that before," Lucinda whispered, her academic detachment completely abandoned in the face of wonder. "Nor have I," Callum admitted. "The fog and lanterns have shown us many things, but this is new." They watched until Lucinda's lantern disappeared from sight, the spiral fog dissolving back into the evening air. Around them the ceremony continued, other wishes rising to join the celestial conversation between earth and sky, human hope and cosmic mystery. Later, walking back toward town, Lucinda was uncharacteristically silent, clearly processing what she had witnessed. Finally, she spoke. "I keep thinking I've reached the limits of what will surprise me here, and then—" "Windmere reveals something new," Callum finished for her. "It's been that way as long as I can remember, though the lanterns have made it more visible these past months." "Do you think—" She hesitated, then continued with scholarly caution. "Do you think the lanterns and fog respond specifically to individuals? To their needs or intentions?" Callum considered the question, remembering the blue lantern's return, the visions in the mist, the countless small miracles that had occurred since he began writing wishes. "I think they respond to openness," he said finally. "To the willingness to see beyond what we think we know, to participate in something larger than ourselves." She nodded slowly. "That aligns with my observations. The most remarkable phenomena tend to occur for those who approach with wonder rather than skepticism." A smile touched her lips. "A conclusion my former professors would find distressingly unscientific." "And yet, no less true for that," Callum replied. They parted at the edge of town, Lucinda to her small cottage near the library, Callum to the path that would take him back up the cliff. As they said their goodbyes, he found himself hoping that her wish, and his words for it, would guide her toward decisions that brought her joy, whether those led her back to mainland academia or kept her in Windmere's embrace. The following weeks brought fullness to spring, wildflowers carpeting the cliffs, fishing boats returning with abundant catches, gardens sprouting with vigorous green life. The town hummed with activity as winter's constraints fell away completely, allowing for repairs and renewals too long delayed. Callum continued his selective wish-writing, focusing on requests that truly needed his particular insight or language. He spent more time in town now, participating in community projects, sharing meals with friends both old and new, finding a balance between the solitude that sustained him and the connections that enriched his days. Lucinda's manuscript made its way through the town council, receiving thoughtful consideration from Eleanor and the others. Their verdict, when it came, was favourable. She had captured something essential about Windmere without exposing its most intimate mysteries, had written with respect and insight about the lantern traditions, while leaving room for what defied documentation. "It reads like a love letter," Eleanor told Callum after she had finished it. "Not just to the town, but to the idea that some things are meant to be experienced rather than explained. I believe she's understood us." The blue lantern continued its impossible vigil on Callum's desk, its flame neither diminishing nor requiring new fuel, its light a constant companion to his work and rest. He had come to see it not as a supernatural curiosity, but as a visible reminder of ongoing connection, to Elaine, to the community, to the mystery that underlay ordinary existence. The note it had carried remained private, tucked away in the drawer built into its base. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would read it again, tracing the flowing script with his finger, allowing himself to believe, if only briefly, that it had indeed come from Elaine. Other times he was content to let the question of its origin remain unanswered, recognizing that the message itself mattered more than its exact provenance. "Thank you for giving my wish words when I couldn't." L. On a perfect morning in late May, as sunlight streamed through his cottage windows and the scent of spring blooms drifted on the breeze, Callum received an unusual visitor. Ida Wells, who rarely left her northern beach cottage, appeared on his porch just as he was finishing breakfast. "Ida," he said, surprised and pleased. "Good morning." Since breaking her long silence the previous summer, she had become more integrated into town life, though still reserved by nature. Her voice, when she used it, remained low and melodious, carrying the cadence of old Windmere in its rhythms. "Good morning, Callum," she replied. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Would you like to come in? I can make fresh tea." She nodded and followed him inside, her gaze immediately drawn to the blue lantern on his desk. "It still burns," she observed. "After all these months." "Without fail," he confirmed, putting the kettle on. "A mystery I've stopped trying to solve." Ida smiled slightly. "The best kind." As they waited for the water to boil, she explained the purpose of her visit. A young family had moved into one of the vacant cottages near hers, a fisherman, his wife, and their infant daughter. The woman was struggling with the isolation of Windmere after life in a larger coastal town, finding it difficult to establish connections in a community where many relationships went back generations. "She needs someone to help her find her place here," Ida said. "I've tried, but—" She gestured vaguely. "I'm not the best guide back into community, given my own history." Callum understood immediately. "You think a wish might help?" "I think your words might help," Ida clarified. "Whether carried by a lantern or spoken directly. You have a gift for seeing what people need, for finding the language that bridges isolation." It was the most direct acknowledgement of his role that anyone in Windmere had articulated, and coming from Ida, who had lived 15 years in self-imposed silence, it carried particular weight. "I'm not sure," he began. I am?" she interrupted gently. "I wouldn't have made the walk up here otherwise." After a moment's consideration, Callum nodded. "I'll visit them this afternoon, if that seems appropriate. Or write something for you to take back, if that would be better." Ida thought for a moment. "Visit, I think. She needs to see that Windmere can welcome newcomers, that it's possible to find one's way here." She sipped her tea, then added with unexpected directness, "As you have, these past months. As I am learning to, again." Later that day, Callum made the walk to the northern beach, carrying a small gift of sea glass he had collected over the years, pieces polished by time and tide into smooth, jewel-like treasures. He found the young family's cottage easily enough, a modest structure that had stood empty for several seasons after its previous occupant passed away. The woman who answered his knock was barely out of girlhood, her face tired but hopeful, an infant cradled against her shoulder. She introduced herself as Mary, explaining that her husband was out with the afternoon fishing crew. "Mrs. Wells mentioned you might stop by," she said, inviting him in. "Though I'm not sure why." The interior of the cottage was sparsely furnished, but scrupulously clean, with small touches, a vase of wildflowers, a colourful quilt that spoke of efforts to create a home in unfamiliar surroundings. Through the back window, Callum could see the northern beach, where Ida had sung for the first time in 15 years, where his blue lantern had mysteriously returned. "I brought something for you," he said, offering the sea glass. "From Windmere's shores. Each piece takes years to become what it is. Broken, then reshaped by the sea into something new and beautiful." Mary accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, examining the frosted colours with appreciation. "They're lovely, thank you." She gestured to a chair. "Would you like to sit? The baby's just fallen asleep, so we can talk quietly." As they conversed, Callum learned more about her situation, the difficult choice to leave a larger community for her husband's opportunity in Windmere's fishing fleet, the isolation of knowing no one while he was at sea for long hours, the challenge of finding her place in a town where relationships seemed already established and complete. "Everyone has been kind," she hastened to add. "But kindness isn't the same as belonging. And without family here, without history." She looked down at her sleeping child. "I want her to grow up somewhere with roots, with connections. I'm just not sure how to begin creating those for her, for us, here." Callum listened with the deep attention he had cultivated through months of wish-writing, hearing not just the words, but the hopes and fears beneath them. When Mary had finished, he was quiet for a moment, allowing what he had heard to find its proper form within him. "Windmere isn't always easy to understand from the outside," he said finally. "It has its own rhythms, its own ways of incorporating new elements. The sea brings things in, the fog transforms them, and eventually they become part of the landscape as if they had always been there." He told her about his own experience, how he had lived for years on the margin of the community, observing but not participating, until a child's request had drawn him back into connection. How that single act had led to others, creating a web of relationships that now sustained him in ways he hadn't known he needed. "The lanterns help," he explained. "They make visible what's otherwise hard to see. The connections between us, the ways our individual hopes form something larger when joined together." Mary listened intently, the baby still sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. "Mrs. Wells mentioned the lanterns," she said. "But I haven't participated yet. It felt presumptuous somehow, like joining a conversation I hadn't been invited to."
"The invitation is always open," Callum assured her. "That's the nature of Windmere's traditions. They expand to include whoever approaches with sincerity."
Before leaving, he wrote a wish for her, not in his usual formal way, but spontaneously, the words flowing from their conversation and his sense of what she needed most. "Let unfamiliar shores become home through small recognitions. Let newness become the foundation for tradition. not its opposite. And may this child grow with roots that reach both backward into Windmere's past and forward into its unwritten future. He suggested she release the wish that evening, offering to accompany her if she felt uncertain about the procedure. But Mary, with newfound determination, assured him she would manage it herself. "I think it's time I began creating our place here," she said, holding the wish carefully. "And this seems like the right beginning." That night, as twilight gathered over Windmere, Callum stood on his porch watching the lanterns rise from various points around the town. From his vantage point, he could see Mary on the northern beach, a small figure with her lantern held before her like an offering. Even at a distance, there was something touching about her solitary participation, her willingness to engage with an unfamiliar tradition in hopes of finding connection. As she released her lantern, the fog, which had been notably absent in recent days, suddenly appeared around it. Not the spiral formation that had accompanied Lucinda's wish, but a gentle halo that seemed to cradle the light as it ascended. The lantern rose steadily, neither racing nor drifting, following a path that carried it directly over the town before continuing out to sea. Watching its journey, Callum felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride in his words, and everything to do with witnessing one more person find their way toward belonging. Whether his wish had any direct effect on Mary's experience in Windmere remained to be seen, but the act of participation itself, of standing on the shore and adding her hope to the community's collective expression, was already a step toward the connection she sought. As spring eased into early summer, Callum continued writing wishes for those who needed them most, not every day, not for everyone, but selectively, when the wind felt just right and the sea was quiet enough to listen. He had come to understand his role not as some mystical scribe, but as a fellow traveller who had learned, through loss and recovery, how to articulate what others sometimes couldn't. The blue lantern maintained its steady vigil on his desk, its flame neither diminishing nor requiring renewal. Lucinda's book was accepted by her publisher, with publication planned for the following spring. She decided to remain in Windmere at least until then, continuing her subtle integration into the community while maintaining enough perspective to complete her scholarly obligations. Windmere itself flourished as summer brought warmer days and lighter hearts. The lantern ceremonies continued their gentle evolution, adapting to changing needs while maintaining their essential character. Some nights the fog would appear with spectacular formations around particular wishes. Other nights it would remain absent entirely, allowing the lanterns to navigate by starlight alone. On a perfect evening in late June, as the sun began its leisurely summer descent toward the horizon, Callum made his way down to the shore for the nightly ceremony. He no longer watched from afar, but stood with his neighbours shoulder to shoulder as the sky filled with small, glowing dreams. Mary was there with her infant daughter, now part of a small circle that included Ida Wells and several other women from the northern side of town. Martin and Elsie Harmon stood near the water's edge, their lantern ready for release. Lucinda Morris moved among the gatherers, occasionally making notes, but mostly simply observing with the quiet appreciation of someone who had found unexpected belonging. As twilight deepened into true evening, the first lanterns were released. Wishes for health and prosperity, for safe journeys and happy returns, for all the ordinary hopes that sustained life in a community dependent on sea and sky for its livelihood. They rose in their customary patterns, some swift and purposeful, others lingering as if reluctant to leave the hands that had crafted them. Callum had written several wishes that day, each carefully tailored to its recipient's needs. But he had also, for the first time in many months, written one for himself. It wasn't a grand declaration or a plea for personal happiness, but a simple acknowledgement of where his journey had brought him. Let me continue finding words when they're needed, silence when it's not. Let the light I've helped nurture continue burning long after I'm gone, carried in lanterns yet unmade, set adrift on seas I'll never sail. He had placed this wish in the blue lantern that still burned on his desk, not releasing it, but allowing it to remain where it was most needed, at the heart of the work he had come to see as his most meaningful contribution to Windmere's ongoing story. As the last lanterns of the evening drifted beyond sight, Callum remained on the shore, watching the horizon where sea met sky in a line that changed with every tide, yet remained eternally the same. Above him, stars emerged one by one, their ancient light joining the more ephemeral glow of wishes rising from human hands. Windmere settled into its nighttime rhythm, lights appearing in windows, the distant bell of the lighthouse marking safe passage, the gentle wash of waves against the shore, and through it all the fog, neither fully present nor entirely absent, but hovering at the edges of perception, ready to make visible, when conditions were right, the connections that always existed beneath the surface of ordinary life. Callum Gray, once solitary in his grief, now stood firmly within the web of relationships his words had helped strengthen. The lanterns would continue rising, carrying wishes beyond the horizon. The fog would come and go, revealing visions that defied explanation, yet felt undeniably true. And through it all, Windmere would remain what it had always been, a place where the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary remained thin enough to allow passage in both directions, where loss could be transformed into new forms of presence, where stories and small gestures created healing beyond what any single heart could accomplish alone. As he turned to walk home, Callum looked back once more at the last visible lantern, a distant point of light almost indistinguishable from the emerging stars. Whether it rose or fell, whether it fulfilled its carrier's wish or simply marked its passage through the night, hardly mattered now. What mattered was the journey itself, the moment of release, the willingness to send hope outward without certainty of its reception. He continued writing wishes, not every day, but when the wind felt just right and the sea was quiet enough to listen. The end. May your dreams be gentle. May your sleep be deep. And when you wake, may you carry a little peace with you. If you enjoyed tonight's story, feel free to return any time. Good night and sweet dreams.